Welcome to the International Recovery Forum 2021. On behalf of the International Recovery Platform, it is my great pleasure to welcome you to International Recovery Forum 2021, Building Back Better from Compound Disasters, Practical Cases and Lessons for Recovery, from Natural Hazards and COVID-19. My name is Yuki Matsuoka. I'm head of the UNDRR office in Japan. I will be facilitating today's forum. The International Recovery Forum is an annual conference that brings together a broad range of recovery stakeholders to share knowledge, exchange experiences, and facilitate discussions on challenges to resilient recovery and opportunities for building back better. Since 2005, the forum has been held every year in Kobe, Japan, organized by the International Recovery Platform Secretariat, in close collaboration with the International Recovery Platform Steering Committee, and with the support of the Cabinet Office of Japan, the Hyogo Prefecture of Government, and the United Nations Office for Disaster Risk Reduction, UNDRR. We are pleased to have the opportunity to hold this forum this year in a hybrid modality, both online and in Kobe. It is our great pleasure to welcome such a broad range of participants from around the world to join us today. Our aims over the course of the next 5 sessions will be to examine priorities and opportunities to build back better, greener, and more resilient from COVID-19 and compound disasters. And secondly, to assess social and economic impact and identify early lessons from sustainable recovery from pandemics and compound disasters. We are honored to have 18 distinguished speakers and moderators speaking from around the world in this forum today. On the IRP website, www.recoveryplatform.org, the program of this forum has been uploaded. You can see the agenda and then also bios of all the speakers we have today in this forum. We are all looking forward to their discussions and then also your active engagement. Before we open our first session, I'd like to share a few words of guidance for your participation. We are offering simultaneous interpretations in English and Japanese. If you wish to hear simultaneous interpretation, please click the globe icon at the bottom of your Zoom screen, and then select English channel or Japanese channel. If you do not click the globe icon and do not select any interpretation channel, you will listen to the original languages by the speakers throughout the forum. Please kindly note that we have 3 speakers who will speak in Japanese today. We will be monitoring your questions and will share them with the moderators for the interactive discussions. If you have a question you'd like to ask any of the panelists, please submit it through the Q&A feature, if possible by specifying to which panelist you'd like to ask that question. The organizer will be monitoring your questions and comments, and will share them with the moderators for their considerations during the interactive discussions. Please kindly note that it is not possible to reply to all received questions. Therefore, the moderators have to select only a few to direct to the panelists as the time permits. But at the same time, the organizer will record all the received questions and then take note of them for our future reference and then for future discussions. So now it is my pleasure to introduce our first speaker in the opening session, Mr. Jared Mercadante. Mr. Mercadante is a disaster risk management specialist with the Global Facility for Disaster Reduction and Recovery at the World Bank. Mr. Mercadante is currently the chair of the IRP Steering Committee. His remarks will be delivered by a prepared video message.
Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all of you who are joining us today. As chair of the IRP Steering Committee, I'd like to express my great appreciation to the Cabinet Office of Japan and the Hyogo Prefecture Government for supporting the 2021 International Recovery Forum. I'd like to also thank all IRP partners and members for their great contributions in today's event. Today is the first time the IRP Forum will be held virtually, but we are greatly appreciative and proud to see so many of you joining us today. The International Recovery Platform was established in 2005 following the second UN Conference on Disaster Risk Reduction. Mandated with supporting the Hyogo Framework for Action responsibilities along post-disaster recovery and reconstruction, addressing the challenges and gaps around this topic. After more than a decade of support, IRP's strategic role was reaffirmed in 2015 following the adoption of the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction. The Sendai Framework, Priority 4, underlines the importance of enhancing disaster preparedness for effective response and to build back better in recovery, rehabilitation, and reconstruction. Here, IRP is recognized as a key international mechanism for sharing experiences, from learning among countries, and all relevant stakeholders in the area of recovery. This International Recovery Forum is a critical venue to support IRP's mission and is an essential role within the IRP framework to share experiences, good practices, and lessons learned from past disasters. Through this forum, we have the opportunity to learn from one another so that we can build back together. The IRP Forum every year addresses timely and pressing issues for recovery. Last year, this forum focused on building back better through resilient infrastructure. Time and time again, we have witnessed the damaging impacts of disaster on infrastructure, which in turn have caused negative consequences on the functioning of communities and the overall development progress of society. As scale of infrastructure needs grow through urbanization and development, new infrastructure investments must build resilience to avoid creating and locking in long-term disaster risks. The forum highlighted the recovery must be used as an opportunity to build back better with greater infrastructure resilience. And these results and outcomes have been well documented and put up on the internet for everybody to see. This year, Building Back Better is again exploring in a great depth through a new entry perspective, looking on that of pandemics. We can all agree that 2020 was an unprecedented year. Many aspects of society and economy have been severely affected by the pandemic, with vulnerable populations suffering disproportionately from COVID-19 global health crisis. Simultaneously, we continue to face challenges and impacts of natural disasters that have compounding impacts on the pandemic. As countries set out on a road to recovery, questions abound on how we can build back better. What early lessons can be learned, and how can the lessons from past disasters be applied to support sustainable recovery today? The pandemic has become much more than a global health crisis. It threatens to unravel decades of development gains and derail global prospects for achieving sustainable development goals by 2030. The global nature of this pandemic and the severity of its consequences demand that every country plans for recovery and builds back better. Every country and community will have its own experiences with this pandemic, and each shall have a unique challenge and response to those challenges. Against the backdrop, the IRP Forum 2021 is being held in the context of IRP's mandate to build back better from compounded disasters. This forum has a significant opportunity to bring challenges and good practices to recovery for COVID-19 and natural disaster hazards in global discussions, and set a plan forward to address priorities and opportunities to build back better and more resilient. Over the past year, IRP has been working to draw upon global partnerships, recovery knowledge, and expertise to produce a series of valuable resources, including a compendium of relevant disaster recovery tools, policy briefs, key actions to help inform decision makers to navigate the unique consequences and circumstances presented by COVID-19. These knowledge products have been made available to all. And as chair of the IRP Steering Committee, I am proud to share these 3 knowledge products as a tangible result of how our collaboration under the International Recovery Platform has been developing. I'm looking forward to learning from the substantive discussions of this forum. On behalf of the International Recovery Platform, I would like to thank all participants who have joined us today, and I look forward to your active contributions to the discussion ahead. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mercadante. I'm now pleased to introduce our next speaker, His Excellency Mr. Okonogi Hachiro. Mr. Okonogi is the Minister of State for Disaster Management for the Government of Japan. Mr. Okonogi has kindly sent a video message to the opening of the forum.
皆さんこんにちは。内閣府防災担当の小野木八郎と申します。国際復興フォーラム2021主催者の一人として開催にあたり一言ご挨拶をいたします。はじめに IRP 議長であります世界銀行のジャレット・メルガダンテさんをはじめ運営委員会の皆様、 IRP の共同事務局である兵庫県の井戸知事をはじめとして兵庫県の皆様方、アジア防災センターの皆様にお礼を申し上げます。本年はコロナ禍の状況を踏まえ、オンラインによる開催となりましたが、継続してこのようにフォーラムが開催されますことを心よりお喜び申し上げます。今月17日に阪神・淡路大震災から26年が経ちました。日本はその復旧・復興に向けて一歩ずつ進んでまいりました。合わせて国際社会からの支援に今もなお感謝しております。内閣府はその後の国内外の防災についての議論の成果として、この IRP が設立されて以来、より良い復興の世界への発信を推進するため、IRP の活動を強く支援してまいりました。現在の国際的な防災指針である仙台防災枠組みにも位置づけられている通り、IRP がより良い復興、すなわちビルドバックベターについて情報共有の核となり、議論を活性化させていくことは大変重要なことです。内閣府としても IRP には引き続きビルドバックベターに関する経験を世界全体で共有するためのハブとしての役割を果たしていきたいと考えております。さて、今年のフォーラムのテーマは、複合災害からの復興、自然災害と COVID-19 パンデミックへの取り組みと、より良い復興のための実践と教訓です。コロナは現在も世界中で猛威を振るっており、この間に生じる自然災害との複合災害の危機に多くの国が直面しています。コロナ禍での復旧・復興に向けた取り組みを進めていく中で、非常に重要なテーマであると考えます。我が国においても、2020年7月に九州地方を中心とした豪雨災害が発生し、 コロナ禍の中で初めての大規模な自然災害を経験しました。現在も被災地の復旧復興に向けて取り組んでいる最中ではありますが、この災害を通じて早期の復旧復興に向けて我が国が学んだことについて2点紹介をしたいと思います。1点目は被災地でのコロナの感染拡大防止の重要性です。我が国では避難所が被災者で密集する状況が生じないように、分散避難の推奨、可能な限り多くの避難所の確保、避難所でのスペースの確保と衛生管理の徹底など、避難所におけるできる限りの感染症対策を講じてきました。早期の復旧、復興のためには、被災地での感染症対策を徹底することが必要不可欠であると考えております。2点目は行政による公助と地域などで互いに助け合う共助の連携の重要性です。我が国でも自助だけでは到底追いつかない共助の担い手として、阪神・淡路大震災以降、全国から多くのボランティアが集まり、被災地の復興・復旧に向けて関わってきました。しかし、コロナ禍の中では、感染拡大防止の観点から、被災地に多くのボランティアが集まることが困難な状況でした。ボランティアの減少を補うために、ボランティアが担っていた被災家屋の片付け等の被災者支援を行政が行いました。このような公助と自助、共助の連携を今まで以上に図っていくことが早期の復旧復興には重要であるとの認識を改めて強くいたしました。本日はコロナと自然災害により影響を受けた国の経験や教訓について、政府機関、国際機関、学識経験者の方々からの講演やパネルディスカッションが行われます。ぜひとも活発なご議論をいただきたいと思います。我が国は災害が多発する国土のある中で、防災政策や技術を絶えず進化させることとなりました。防災先進国として、これまでの災害から得られた貴重な教訓を国内外に発信をし、世界の防災対策の充実につなげていくためにも、本日のフォーラムは貴重な機会です。結びとなりますが、コロナ禍での災害からの復興は、今を生きる人類にとって、すべての国にとって初めての経験です。だからこそ、本日のフォーラムで議論される各国の経験や教訓が、より多くの世界中の方々に共有され、世界の防災対策の強化に資するものとなることを祈念いたしまして、開会の挨拶といたします。ありがとうございました。
Thank you very much, Mr. Okonogi. It is now my great honor to welcome the Governor of Hyogo Prefecture, Mr. Ido Toshizo, to the podium to give him his welcome remarks. Governor Ido, the podium is yours.
皆さん、こんにちは。いや、おはようございます。こんばんはと言わなきゃいけないかもしれません。内外から多くのご参加を得て、国際復興フォーラム2021が開催されています。今年は新型コロナウイルスの感染拡大防止の観点から、このようにオンラインの開催となりました。兵庫に神戸にお越しいただけないことは誠に残念ですが、世界各国からウェブを通じて本フォーラムにご参加いただいておりますことを主催者の一人として厚くお礼申し上げます。また、開催にあたりましてご尽力いただいた関係の皆様に改めて感謝を申し上げます。新型コロナウイルス感染症が今もなお世界で猛威を振るっています。兵庫県でも年明けから感染拡大のスピードが増しており、大変厳しい状況にあります。去る1月13日には隣接する大阪府、京都府とともに国の緊急事態宣言の対象区域に指定されました。 県民事業者の皆様には、飲食店等の営業時間の短縮、不要不急の外出自粛、出勤者の7割削減、イベント開催時の参加人数の制限など、厳しい取り組みを要請しています。医療提供体制の崩壊を防ぎ、県民の命と健康を守るため、何としても感染拡大を食い止めなければなりません。今がまさに正念場です。県民一丸となってこの危機を乗り越えてまいります。コロナの下で、目の前の危機があるわけでありますが、だからといって自然災害は待ってくれません。地球温暖化に伴う異常気象によって風水害をはじめ、毎年のように各地で甚大な被害が発生しています。南海トラフ地震など迫り来る巨大地震への備えも強化しなければなりません。今年の1月17日で阪神・淡路大震災から26年を迎えました。震災を経験し、内外の皆様の温かい支援をいただき、力強く立ち上がってきた私たちだからこそ、その経験や教訓を広く発信し、安全安心な社会づくりの先頭に立って歩んでいかなければなりません。兵庫県では、忘れない、伝える、生かす、備えるの4つのコンセプトを柱に、県民の皆様と共に、ハード、ソフト、両面での幅広い取り組みを進めています。その上で、日頃から防災について考え、行動する災害文化の定着を目指しています。本日のテーマは、複合災害からの復興です。阪神・淡路大震災からの復興の過程で、私たちが掲げた理念は、創造的復興でした。単に震災前の状態に回復させるのではなく、21世紀の成熟社会にふさわしい社会の姿を目指す兵庫の復興モデルは、今ではビルトバックベタとして国連の防災対策のメルクマール仙台防災枠組みにも位置づけられています。コロナ禍において都市の脆弱性など現代社会が抱える課題も浮き彫りになりました。一方、人々のライフスタイルや価値観は大きく変化しつつあります。時代はまさに転換期を迎えていると言えるのではないでしょうか。兵庫県は創造的復興を成し遂げましたが、今またポストコロナ社会の挑戦に直面しています。ポストコロナ社会の新しい時代潮流を踏まえながら、安全で安心できる地域空間の形成、情報社会を支える基盤づくり、人生100年時代の生活の在り方などに取り組み、ポストコロナ社会にふさわしい復興にしていかなければなりません。大規模災害からの復興には、内外からの息の長い人的支援も欠かせません。各被災地では災害ボランティア、災害派遣、医療チーム DMAT、震災学校支援チーム ARTH などが復興に大きな役割を果たしています。新型コロナウイルスの感染リスクを恐れるあまり、こうした人的支援の輪が途切れることがあってはなりません。昨年、兵庫県では災害ボランティアの健康と安全を確保し、被災地での感染拡大を防止するため、派遣前にあらかじめ公費で PCR 検査を受診できる制度を設けました。また、避難所や福祉避難所の設置基準などを見直して、コロナ禍の複合災害にも対応することにしています。コロナ禍にあっても復興がスムーズに進むよう、各国、各地域が被災地における安全確保対策の仕組みづくりの研究を重ね、それをあらかじめ復興計画などでしっかり位置づけておくことが必要であると考えています。 新型コロナウイルスの知見の共有、ワクチン開発などを例に挙げるまでもなく、大規模な災害や危機には国や地域を超えた地球レベルでの連帯が欠かせません。18回を迎えたこの IRP フォーラムはもとより、各国や関係機関が共通の課題に連携して立ち向かい、日頃から顔の見える信頼関係を構築しておくことが、いざという時の速やかな復興につながる。このように確信しています。本日のフォーラムがご参加の皆様にとって実り多いものになること、そしてこれを機に防災減災に取り組む人々のネットワークが一層広がり、強固なものになりますことを心からお祈りし、開会のご挨拶とさせていただきます。ありがとうございました。
Thank you very much, Governor Ido, for your remarks and your warm welcome. Before we move into the main program of the forum, we would like to invite our participants to join a short poll today. The first question is intended to help us get a sense of participants' interest within the theme of recovery. Please let me show the first question. The question is, what are the biggest challenges for building back better from COVID-19 and compound disasters? I will post the poll now for 10-20 seconds, and we will have a look at the live result before we move on to the next main program. Yes, we are having more than 50% of the participants replied. Let me wait for additional 5 seconds. Yes. Okay, so now let me, yes, it's still going up. So please allow me to wait for 5 seconds. Yes, great. So now let me pause the voting here. So now let's have a look at the result. I will show you the result on the screen. So the highest percentage is implementing recovery during the ongoing response. This is the 43%. And then it seems the second one seems to be 31%. Number 3, financing resilient recovery. We will do the second poll actually at the end of the forum so that we can get to know some of your immediate reflections after listening to the substantive discussion at the end of the forum. Having concluded our opening session and our initial poll, without further delay, I'm now pleased to open the main program with the keynote presentations. We are honored to have 2 distinguished keynote speakers today. Our first keynote speaker today is Professor Kawata Yoshiaki. He is the head of the Research Center for Societal Safety Science, a specially appointed professor at Kansai University, and the executive director of the Disaster Reduction and Human Renovation Institution. He is the recipient of the United Nations Sasakawa Award for Disaster Risk Reduction in 2007. The UN Sasakawa Award for Disaster Risk Reduction is being administered by UNDRR. He is presenting today, Building Resilience to Compound Disasters, including COVID-19 and natural hazards. Professor Kawata, the podium is yours.
ありがとうございます。今ご紹介いただきました川田でございます。最初の講演としてですね、この学術的にこのコロナパンデミックス、COVID-19 というものが、典型的な複合災害である。そしてこの複合災害の中で、また自然災害が起こるっていう、いわゆる古典的な複合災害ということになっているということをお話ししたいと思います。この複合災害という概念は実は 阪神・淡路大震災の時に私が定義した概念であります。すなわち、2つの災害がお互いに関係しながら起こるわけですけれども、二次災害とか三次災害と違って、後から起こる災害による被害の方が最初の被害よりも大きい。こういう定義でございます。ですから、この今コロナパンデミックスが世界的に広がっているわけですけれども、ここで先ほど小此木大臣からご紹介ありましたように、東京で首都直下地震が起こる、あるいは南海地震が起こると、とんでもない被害になるわけであります。ですから、起こる前にそれへの対応をどうするかということを考えなければいけない。こういうことで、私はその複合災害の学術的な特徴を今日短い時間でございますけれども、お話をしようというわけであります。ですから、このコロナパンデミックもそうですし、大きな災害もそうですけれども、たくさんの人が住んでいる、活動している大都市で起きますと、非常に大きな災害になるわけです。私はここで都市という概念というのは、たくさんの人が集まっているところというふうに定義していますから、いわゆる東京とかニューヨークとかロンドンとか、あるいはマニラとか、そういうたくさんの人が住んでいるところを対象とした考え方なんでありますけれども、決して大都市でしか適用できないというわけではなくて、人が集まっているところでコンパウンドディザスター、この複合災害が起こると大変大きな被害になる。しかも、この今、世界経済というのが実はネットワーク構造になっています。これが実はこのパンデミックによる社会経済被害を非常に大きくしている。なぜかと言いますと、コロナの拡散というのは、このネットワーク上を実は高速で広がっているわけであります。ネットワークというのは、実はノードとエッジでできています。コロナの場合はノードクラスターと言います。我が国でもこの感染初期の段階では、このクラスターになるのは医療機関、あるいは高齢者の福祉施設、あるいは人々がたくさん集まるアミューズメントの施設で発生いたしました。で、もう今は第3次の大きな拡大期に入っていまして、もうそれ以上のですね、拡大になっている。一般のご家庭でも実はパンデミック広がってきているわけであります。大変コントロールが難しい状況になっている。こういう複合災害の非常に大きな特徴がですね、時代的に現れてきているということなんであります。ですから、私の講演は3つのパートで構成しています。一つは、都市災害というのは、実は自然災害とか COVID-19 とかテロ事件が都市で起こるという共通の大災害の特徴を持っている。それから、なぜそんなに大きな被害になるのかというのは、実は複合災害になっているからだということを知っていただきたい。COVID-19 も典型的な複合災害です。なぜかと言いますと、中世の時代に起こったこのペストによるパンデミックというのは、実は3密対策とか、あるいは都市封鎖、こういったことが効果的であったわけであります。ですけど、現代はそうではありません。人々は飛行機、あるいは高速列車、自動車、いろんな形で瞬時に拡散するという特徴を持っています。そのネットワーク的な動きが実はコロナの感染と重なっているわけであります。ですから、COVID-19 も複合災害だと考えなければいけないというわけなんであります。じゃあどうすればいいのかということで、ここで皆様方に想定員が起こっているということを知っていただきたい。想定員というのは、もともと自然科学で使われている言葉です。例えば、水というのは普通液体です。ですけども、0度 C より温度が下がりますと、いきなり氷になります。液体が固体になるんですね。100度を超えると、今度は液体が気体になります。このように温度が変わることによって、水の性質が極端に変わります。こういう現象が実は社会現象でも起こっていると考えなければいけない。つまり、コロナパンデミックスがこれだけもう1億人を超える感染者を出すというのは、もうこの想定員が実は起こっていると考えないと 感染症を防ぐことはできないということを知っていただきたい。そして、特にこのワクチンが開発されるまで手の打ちようがないということでは困るわけであります。ワクチンというのは自然科学がもたらす文明的な主産であります。それがなければ、これを阻止できないという時代になっては困るわけであります。つまり、災害文化といいますと、我々の日常生活の上でのこの抑止力、こういったものを高めなければいけない。今、国連では SDGs というものが2030年までの目標で実現されようとしておりますけれども、実はこのコロナのパンデミックによって、このサステナブルディベロップメントゴールズの第一の目標、すなわち貧困をなくそうということが、もう実現が非常に難しいというふうなことに直面しているわけであります。そういう意味でも、この SDGs を効果的に進めなければいけないという観点から、このコロナの問題を対処しなければいけないというわけであります。さて、私は従来自然災害を中心に研究してまいりました。ですけれども、その過程において、実は自然災害だけではなくて、感染症、あるいはテロ事件、こういったものも都市における大きな被害をもたらすものだというふうに気がつきました。ご承知のように20年前にアメリカで同時多発テロがありました。そしてニューヨークではワールドトレードセンタービルに2機の旅客機が突入して2700人の方が亡くなりました。こういった現象というのは実はテロ事件なんでありますけれども、これを都市の災害というふうに考えて対処しなければいけない。なぜかと言いますと、ニューヨークっていうのは大きな地震が起こるところではありません。ですけれども、被害の惨状というのは、まさにニューヨークの下で直下型地震が起こった時と同じような状況を示しているわけであります。すなわち、テロ事件をどうするかということと、大きな自然災害が起こったらどうするかということが非常によく似ているということなんであります。こういったことで、都市域で起こる災害そのものを実はどうコントロールするか。そこにはそれが想定によって大きな被害が出ていると考えなければいけないというわけなんであります。ですから、この自然災害の知識だけでは被害は少なくできないわけであります。なぜかと言いますと、実は社会現象なんであります。ですから、普通はこの自然災害というのはハザードが起こす被害をもたらすものなんでありますけれども、ハザードの段階でとどまっていると、これをコントロールできない。ディザスターとなって被害が出た段階でどうするかということを考えなければいけない。もっと分かりやすく言いますと、実は自然災害なんですけれども、実は社会現象なんであります。私たちの社会のありようが実は災害によって被害が大きくなったり小さくなったりしているわけであります。ですから、最悪全体に関する広範な知識が不可欠ですし、そうなりますと、サイエンスだけの知識では解析できないんであります。感染症の専門家だけでは、このコロナの問題は解決できないんであります。いわゆる政治的な問題になっているということであります。ですから、私どもは今、これはトランスサイエンスの問題である。このトランスサイエンスというのは、ここの英語で書いてございますように、questions which can be asked of science and yet which can't be answered by science。すなわち、感染症の専門家の意見だけでは解決できないということを私たちは理解しなければいけないわけであります。そして、このたくさんの人が住んでいるところで都市災害にならないようにしなければいけない。そのためには被害の想定を発生してはいけないんだということなんであります。ですから、事前に何が想定になるかを明らかにすれば、レジリエンス力を高め、被害は劇的に少なくでき、またより良い復興にも資するというわけなんであります。で、これまで、例えば我が国では、首都直下地震とか南海トラフの巨大地震をどう迎えるかということが非常に大きな問題になっておりました。ですけれども、対策は相場的にならざるを得ませんでした。ですけれども、このコロナの問題が起こって、一体どこを攻めれば被害が小さくなるかが分かってきたわけであります。なぜかと言いますと、南海トラフの巨大地震とか首都直下地震が起こったときに、被害の想定が起こらなければいいわけであります。じゃあ一体どこで起こるのか。これが実は問題になっているということなんであります。これが分かれば、非常に大きな効果が期待できるというわけなんであります。この図面は実は今から 31年前に私が日本災害学会の学術賞をもらった図面であります。どういう図面かと言いますと、横軸は都市の人口密度と国全体の人口密度の比なんであります。例えば10というのは、例えば今神戸市は1平方キロにおよそ3000数百人住んでいます。日本全体では1平方キロにおよそ330人です。すなわち横軸の10のところに実は神戸市があるわけで、そうしますと普通の人口密度のところで起こる災害に比べると非常に大きな被害になっているわけであります。今から30年前にこの図面を作った時には、もちろん阪神・淡路大震災起こっていませんでした。K というデータはありませんでした。ですからこの T というのは1923年の関東大震災における東京、Y が横浜であります。M というのは1985年のメキシコ地震のメキシコシティのデータなんであります。この3点というのが従来の被害よりも非常に大きくなっているということを私が見出したわけであります。で、実はその後、阪神・淡路大震災が起こって、まさにこの K というデータがここにプロットされることになったわけであります。すなわち、都市で大きな災害になるのは想定員が起こったからだ。例えば、阪神・淡路大震災で何が想定員かと言いますと、それまでは都市で火災が起こらなければ、地震が起こっても大きな被害にはならないというふうに考えていたわけであります。実は阪神・淡路大震災では直後に亡くなった5500人のうち5000人は古い木造住宅の全壊倒壊で亡くなったわけであります。これは起こってから分かったんであります。起こるまでそれが凶器になるということは誰も気づきませんでした。すなわちそれが想定員が起こったという証拠なんであります。ですからこのコロナの問題が非常に深刻なのは、実はすでにもう世界経済が想定員で変わっているということなんであります。具体的に申し上げますと、このようにこの英語でネットワークという単語とヒエラルキーっていう単語、垂直統合型のヒエラルキーっていう単語の言葉がですね、一体英語で出版される中でどれぐらい使われているかというこの頻度なんであります。1980年以降、このネットワークという言葉が非常に使われている。すなわち世界の社会経済構造っていうのは実は垂直統合型からネットワークに相転移していたんであります。専門的に申し上げますと、二次相転移ということできちっと調べなければわからないような相転移のことを言うわけであります。水が温度によって変わるというのは目で見てわかります。これは一次の相転移と言います。すなわちこのコロナの問題が起こる前に世界社会経済っていうものがもう想定員を実は被っていたというわけであります。そこにこのコロナが広がったというわけであります。ですから分かりやすく申し上げますと、旧来は垂直型の階層性になっていたのが今は分散型のネットワークになっている。これはどうしてそうなったかと言いますと、コンピューターのソフトで Web2.0 というのが実は開発されて、それまで情報というのは上下に実は流れていたわけでありますが、この Web2.0 によって水平にかつ瞬間的にたくさんの人が共有できるという世界になったわけであります。もっと分かりやすく言いますと、自動車産業でトヨタとテスラというのがあります。ご承知のようにトヨタは世界一生産台数が多い1000万台を超えているわけであります。しかしその36分の1の生産台数のテスラが実は株価の時価総額がトヨタの倍あるわけであります。こういういわゆる考え方の違いっていうものが如実に実は出てきているというのが現代社会の特徴なんであります。これは1点が1億ドル、つまり100万ドルのこの商いが世界の貿易でどういうふうに構成されているかということであります。世界の貿易はこのように全部ネットワーク上に実は広がっているわけであります。これに実はコロナの拡散が乗っかっているということなんであります。また世界で巨大な情報産業というのもここに模式的に示してございますようにネットワーク型になっています。じゃあこの巨大情報産業がなぜ大きな被害を受けていないか。実は指揮命令系統が垂直統合型が残っているわけであります。すなわちこの蜘蛛の巣というのは実は蜘蛛が1匹しかいません。 クモの巣は、典型的なネットワーク構造であります。クモの巣に3匹4匹のクモがいると喧嘩になるわけであります。1匹で実はコントロールしている。だけど、この私たちが作っている経済社会のネットワークっていうのは、その1匹を支えるシンクタンクが実は必要なわけで、これが垂直統合型でやっているという、こういうハイブリッド型になっているところが、この巨大な情報産業が、実は現在もコロナの中で頑張っているということに、実はつながっているというわけであります。ですから、この自然災害と感染症拡大の相似性ということを考えていただきますと、実は感染症は、ご承知のように中国の武漢、人口1100万の都市で起こった当初はエピデミックでした。ところがそれがすぐにパンデミックに拡大したわけであります。人的ネットワーク、あるいは社会のネットワーク構造が複雑化してパンデミックになったというわけであります。ですから、対策としては社会に存在する各種ネットワークのノードとエッジを切り離すということなんであります。ただし、全体を孤立化させると社会経済はダウンします。7割テレワークでもう会社に来てこなくていいっていうような日本が最初にやった対策っていうのは社会経済全体が麻痺するわけであります。もっときめ細かな対策をやらなければいけないっていう案であります。あらゆるものをいわゆる3密対策で行こうとすると社会全体がダメになるっていうのはネットワーク構造から見れば明らかなんであります。ですからこの被害拡大というのはノードとエッジを実は作りながら拡大しているということでありますから、感染症の場合はクラスターの形成を阻止する。都市災害の場合は停電、断水、通信障害などの社会インフラっていうのが実は停止しますと、これが実は次の大きな災害の原因になるわけであります。例えば東京で停電が長期化しますとテレワークもできません。すなわち停電というのは被害であると同時に次の災害を起こす大きな原因になるわけであります。ですから複合災害に実はなるというわけなんであります。ですからこのエッジとノードをどうやってコントロールするか、こういうことが実はこのコロナの問題を収束させる大きなヒントになるわけであります。そのためには事前の予防力と事後の回復力、いわゆるディザスターレジリエンスというのは実は事後の回復力だけではありません。起こる前の予防力を強くしておく、こういうことも大切なんであります。そうしますと、この図は実は世界の一人当たりの名目 GDP が我が国より多い25カ国について今回の感染率がどうなっているかという図なんであります。すなわち我が国よりも経済的に豊かな国、実は感染率が高いんであります。普通常識的には社会が経済的に豊かになれば感染率は下がるというふうに考えることが普通なんでありますが、逆に一人当たりの所得の多い国ほど感染率が高いということをこの図は示しているわけであります。すなわちワクチンができるまでは対処のしようがないというわけではないんであります。ワクチンだってお金がなければ接種することができません。ですから途上国よりも先進国の方がワクチンの普及は早く進むということが考えられるわけでありますが、ですけどもワクチンが適用されると感染率がストレートに下がるかというと、この図はそうは示していないというわけであります。すなわち経済的な豊かさだけではダメだということをこの感染率の変化は示しているわけであります。ですからこれまで私たちは科学を基準とした災害文明によってこの自然災害を中心にコントロールしようと考えていました。そこには最終的にはベストソリューションがあるという形で進めてきたわけであります。ですけれどもコロナの問題が起こってベストソリューションなんか見つかりません。例えばワクチンが開発されても変異種っていうそれに適合しない新種のウイルスが変化するということが実はもう起こっているわけであります。ですからそうなりますとベストソリューションじゃなくてベストエフォートというものが効果を示すような社会にならなければいけないというわけなんであります。これは最後の図なんでありますけども、この災害文明の上に災害文化が載っておる旧来の形から実は最近はおかしくなっています。なぜかと言いますと自然科学がどんどん進んでそのプロダクツが実は 防災に大きな力を持ってきている。我が国で申し上げますと、緊急地震速報、ハザードマップ、いろんなこの科学的なツールを用いた防災力を強くするということがどんどん進んでいます。でも、大雨が降って洪水氾濫が起こる、その時に避難指示勧告が出ても、住民は逆に避難しないんであります。すなわち、住民の中での災害文化になっていないということが非常に大きな問題になっているわけであります。このコロナの問題も、ワクチンがあればなんとかなるっていう、そういう短絡的な考えでは、このコロナには勝てないわけであります。ですから、私たちの日常の生活習慣になるような、そういう文化を作らなければ、このコロナには対処できない。すなわち、これから多分世界を席巻するであろう、コンパウンドディザスター、この複合災害に対しては、文明だけの力ではダメなんだと。文化を高めるということをやらないと、抑えることができないということをご理解いただきたいと思います。どうもご清聴ありがとうございました。
Thank you very much, Professor Kawata, for your insightful presentation and then for introducing your perspective for building resilience through disaster culture in our highly networked society. Reflecting on your presentation, please allow me to come back to you with a couple of questions later during the discussion. Now, I'd like to introduce second keynote speaker, Mr. Stefan Halgat. He is the lead economist with the Global Facility for Disaster Reduction and Recovery at the World Bank. He is presenting disaster risk management during the COVID-19 crisis and recovery. Mr. Halgat was a lead author of the fifth assessment report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC. He is the author of dozens of articles published in international journals in multiple disciplines and of several books. Names of his most recent publications are mentioned within his bio in the program. He's based in Washington, D.C., and his time is around midnight. Thank you very much, Mr. Halgat, for your kind participation from Washington tonight at this late hour for you. Mr. Halgat, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for the invitation to participate to this very important discussion. It's a pleasure to be here in the middle of the night. I'm sorry that this was not the occasion to visit Japan, but I hope to have another occasion very soon. What I want to talk about is how to do disaster risk management in the current context of the COVID-19 crisis and recovery. And I will touch on three different issues. One is the similarities and the differences between the COVID-19 crisis and I would say more traditional disasters that we're more used to. Then I will talk about those compound shocks in the sense that the current situation doesn't mean that other disasters cannot happen. So we have to think about how different we should react now if something would occur during this very special period. And finally, I'll discuss about the recovery out of COVID-19 and how we can make that recovery an opportunity to build back better in a way that is more resilient, but also more sustainable and also more efficient toward a more prosperous future. So if you put the next slide, I'll just move to my first point, which is to discuss the similarities and differences between COVID-19 and other disasters. And the first thing showed in the next slide is the first is a similarity. So if you show the next slide, all disasters, if you look at the impact not on a country or a city, but if you look at the impact on people, we find that poor people lose very little in value. So if you count those impacts in US dollars, you'll find very small amounts. But if you're looking at the impact on their well-being, their quality of life, their long-term prospects, poor people tend to suffer much more than the average. Here you see a map of the Philippines, showing where the risk is located when you're using a monetary metric. So the value of the damages in, say, US dollars or Filipino pesos. And of course, you see Manila in that map because that's where a lot of the high value assets are located. So if you look at risk in the monetary value, you see where wealth is located. What you see on the left is the distribution of losses per person for 5 quintile, from the poorest on the left to the richest on the right. And what you see is if you look at asset losses, so the monetary losses, well, rich people are losing more, and that's because they have more to lose in the first place. But if you take into account the situation of poor people, and especially the fact that they have less to start with, a big part of their consumption is consumption of essential goods and services like food, health, education. If you take into account that they don't have access to the same tools and instruments, they don't have insurance, they don't have saving accounts, they don't have access to borrowing, to repair. If you take all of that into account, then you find that poor people are much more affected. And if now we think about COVID-19, we have the same thing. We might look at the losses in GDP, losses expressed in US dollars or other monetary metrics. Those impacts do not show us what it does to poor people. And if we care about the well-being of the population more than anything else, then we really have to complement those metrics in US dollars with different metrics that makes it possible to see what happens to poor people. If you go to the next slide, there is another thing which is similar between the disasters we are dealing with, earthquakes, hurricanes, floods, and COVID-19. It's the role of supply chains and trade. So I show a picture of the Bay Bridge in San Francisco because that's one of the best examples I have of how a critical piece of infrastructure can be damaged even just a little bit. And maybe the damage in terms of reconstruction cost is not that high, but because the Bay Bridge is a critical connector in the Bay Area, the impact on the economy can be absolutely massive. And if you look only at the direct effect, you would completely miss what this damage to this bridge might be doing to, I don't know, a small restaurant in one side of that bridge. For COVID-19, we have a little bit of the same issue. Initially, people were focusing on the occupations and jobs that were the most directly affected because they cannot be done while distancing. Now, with the time of this crisis, we see that some jobs are being affected by secondary effect through supply chains. So I did not know how to illustrate that for COVID-19, so this is a picture of an accountant. An accountant is perfectly able to work remotely, but still, if you look at data in the US, you see that this is one domain where people have been losing their job and income, not directly, but indirectly. And those two very important points, the distributional impacts and the fact that poor people tend to be more affected, but also the fact that losses are distributed very heterogeneously and are propagated through a very complex network of relationship, is really important when we speak to the people in charge of the situation right now. Because our community working on disasters have a lot of experience assessing the losses, thinking about who is affected and how to target support to the people affected. If you're talking about the people used to manage economic crisis, the type of impacts that they are used to are very different. So I think there is a value in our community stepping in and bringing the experience of targeting support to affected people after disasters, because this is really what we need in this COVID-19 context. If you go to the next slide, there is one big difference between COVID-19 and a lot of the disasters that we're used to talk about. For earthquake or a cyclone, the impact has two legs. One is, this is a factory being destroyed by a hurricane. This factory cannot produce. So there is an impact on economic activity, which shows in GDP. And there is a second leg, which is the impact on consumption, because not only this factory cannot produce, but somebody needs to pay to rebuild it. And for most disasters, the impact through this consumption channel is very significant. And if you move to the next slide, it means that the faster you can rebuild, the lower the losses. So on the left, you see a little figure illustrating that. It's how much losses are increased when the reconstruction duration increases. So for a 10-year reconstruction duration, for instance, we estimate that the total losses are about twice the losses for the same amount of damages if you can rebuild in about a year. And this means that accelerating the reconstruction is an absolutely critical aspect, and of course everybody in this conference will know a lot about that. We estimated that with just a better reconstruction process, we could reduce the total impact of disasters by about 1/3 in the world, not changing the direct damages, just by rebuilding better. And this has been a big focus of our work. If you go to the next slide, for COVID, things are very different because you don't have like one shock and a reconstruction. Instead, you have this back and forth between lockdown, not lockdown, restrictions, more relaxed periods, and so on. And so here, I think the good analogy is with drought. And for two reasons. First, because of these slow onset characteristics where things can get worse and then better and then worse again. But also because in a drought, economic impacts are through the lack of water, but also through the restrictions that we impose to preserve water. And so a part of the damages comes from the policies we implement. And it means that we can learn from what we have done for drought. I'm thinking about tools like the US Drought Monitor, which is a set of criteria on the situation of the drought in the country, linking to some of the measures that can be implemented in a way that is predictable and that everybody knows. So it allows planning by private actors. And this is, I think, the right direction. I think in the other direction, we working on disasters like earthquakes, flood, and droughts have to learn from the COVID experience in terms of the communication to the population and this ability to just adjust measures to the situation. So if you go to the next slide, just to conclude on this first part, the point I wanted to make here mostly is that in Ministries of Finance and Ministry of Economy at the moment, a lot of people are managing the COVID crisis like an economic crisis. I think knowledge from how to manage a disaster is relevant here because this is not your normal economic crisis, and especially impacts are distributed very differently, and we need to take that into account in how we help people. My second point of discussion will be about the vulnerability today to other disasters due to the COVID-19 situation. And here, like a lot of the work we've been doing in the last years, we want to think at the household level. So vulnerability being thought of for a family as the unit of analysis, not so much the city or not so much the country. If you go to the next slide, this is a very simple depiction of the tools that people use when they are affected by a disaster. And there are many tools. There is not one thing. And people use different tools depending on whether they are affected by small shocks, like a little flood in a village, or like very, very intense disasters, like a major earthquake. You don't use the same tools in those two situations. And similarly, poor people will not use the same tools than rich people. So what we have is this puzzle of different instruments with like revenue diversification for small shocks, and then you use your savings, you go borrow, or you use market insurance, but that's mostly for rich people. Poor people tend to rely quite a lot on adaptive social protection systems. The important point here is that all of those tools, all of them have been affected by COVID-19. And the ability of governments to help has been reduced because a lot has been spent. So if something else happened now, the resources will be more difficult to mobilize. Even insurers have been affected by COVID-19 But the point I wanted to make mostly, and it's illustrated in the next slide, is the role of people saving. So this figure is a little bit complicated, but I think it's really telling. This is for the Philippines again. And on the x-axis, you have people at different income levels. And the green bars are the amount of savings those people have in a household survey made before COVID. And the dark line, the first one at the bottom, is the income they make in 1 month. The other lines are for 2 months and 3 months. And what you can see is all the people below $300 per month in the country, more or less, they have less than 1 month of income in savings, which means that if they lose income for 1 month and they want to keep consumption as it is, they will have no savings. So we're talking about 50 million people in the country with no precautionary savings after 1 month. After a year of COVID-19, it means that precautionary savings in the world today, we don't have hard data, but have probably been used and more than used, which means that this buffer that all of the families tend to have, and which is so important because that's what is there immediately. You don't need public action. You don't need an insurance claim to be paid. This buffer has probably disappeared for many, many people. So if something bad happens now, like happened in Indonesia, unfortunately, a few weeks ago, the needs for intervention from the government perspective is probably much, much higher because those buffers that people have has been used already. So again, I think this is role of this community to make that very clear, because if something happens, reaction needs to be very urgent. Next slide, I move to the last part of my presentation, which is a discussion about what we can do in the post-COVID recovery. And here I say post-COVID, COVID will stay a little longer with us, it seems. But as the emergency, the health emergency is getting more and more under control, the question will be to fix the damages made to our societies and economies. Next slide. It has to be done with a huge increase in poverty and a huge increase in debt. So not an easy place to be. Next slide. What we want to say first is a lot of countries have built up their social protection system to respond to COVID. A lot of new systems have been created in urgency. When the crisis is over, we should not let those systems go away. I'm not saying that we should continue handing money to people, but the infrastructure, the systems to help people in a crisis that we have created needs to stay maybe in a dormant situation so that next time something like that happens, we can trigger those systems much quicker than last time. Next slide. Then we can use the recovery spending to get all sorts of benefits. So everybody will want to spend public money to create jobs and boost the activity, but we can use those resources to also build the long-term growth, build resilience, and contribute to the green growth and the decarbonization of our energy systems. We at the World Bank have created this sustainability checklist to help governments select the right projects that can deliver short-term benefits and long-term benefits. And that's really something that we want to promote and use as much as we can. Next slide. There is one thing we have been discussing quite a lot, the fact that green projects like solar energy, urban transport, all of that is very good to create jobs. You have to check that your population has the right skills and that your projects are ready to go, but there is a huge potential in creating short-term jobs with green projects that can also help your economy over the long term. Next slide. Today is not the case. Today, if you look at the recovery packages for COVID and the money spent in energy in those packages, about half is in fossil fuels. So a lot is investing in the technologies from yesterday, which means that countries would get out of the COVID crisis with the same problems they had before, instead of trying to use that to leapfrog and get out of COVID in a better place. Next slide. there is a huge potential in spending this recovery money in building resilience. We have estimated that every dollar invested in resilience brings back $4 in avoided losses. So it's a very good investment. And if you move to the next slide, I want to stress one specific opportunity, which is maintenance. A lot of countries have a backlog in maintenance, and that is responsible for a lot of the damages from disasters. If you don't cut your forests, the first storm, you have no power because your transmission lines will be down. In many countries, maintaining roads is much more efficient to improve your service than building new roads. Next slide. So maintenance is a good idea, and it's also very quick to put in place, and it's also very labor intensive. So here you see the job created with $1 million in new assets. And if you go to the next slide, you see the same thing for maintenance. So there is no real competition, right? Maintenance, your projects can go much quicker, and you will create much more job with that. So if you have a backlog in maintenance and it creates lack of reliability for your infrastructure, this is a very good place to go spend money. Next slide. So just to conclude, we have applied those ideas in a case study in Fiji. We started from the climate vulnerability assessment in Fiji, which is a set of 125 interventions to build the resilience of the islands. Next slide. And what we did, and this will be my last slide, what we did is out of these 125 interventions, we looked at which ones are good to create a short-term stimulus, but also good for resilience, good for the environment, and good for long-term progress and growth in the country. And we highlighted 10 measures for 3% of GDP that can tick all of those boxes. So lesson here is when we do those recovery packages, there is no reason to look only at the short-term benefits and to leave on the table all of the long-term benefits that we can capture at the same time. We can create packages that deliver over the short term and over the long term, and this is where the highest value lies. So I'll stop here, and I'll thank you very much for the invitation again, and looking forward to the rest of the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Holgett, for your very insightful presentation. So we are very pleased to have the opportunity for some Q&A session with our speakers, with the time we have remaining in the session for approximately 7-8 minutes. So I'd like to start with Professor Kawata first. So your last slide mentioned that a generation of the paradigm shift is needed. What realistic actions can we take to create this paradigm shift from the disaster civilization to disaster culture? Any example of concrete action you could share with us? That would be great. Thank you.
災害の文化っていうのを分かりやすく言いますと、やっぱり控除の部分が非常に大きいわけですよね。で、控除の部分で、要はですね、財源がたくさんいる。あるいは時間がかかるという特徴があるんですね。で、それを優先しようとすると、それ以外のものが実はできないという、選択が出てくるんですね。まあ、我が国のその大きな対策っていうのは全部そういう特徴を持ってるわけですね。で、これをですね、どうするかっていうと、控除からですね、自助共助を中心に持っていく。すなわち、私たちの生活している場でですね、やれるところからみんなでやるという、こういうふうにシフトしないと、対策というとすぐに、公的なところでどうするんだということになっているんですけれども、そうじゃなくて、私たちが持っている知恵を使ってですね、一番起こりうる災害による被害をどうやって小さくするかっていうのは、実は控除では間に合わないんですよね。我が国でやっている対策って、ほとんどそういう特徴を持ってるんですね。で、今まで日本っていうのは、控除がどんどん、力をつけてきましたので、逆に住民は、控除に任せておいたら大丈夫だという錯覚があったと。これをそうじゃないんだよと、みんなが、日頃持ってる知恵を中心にやらないと、いくら、ちゃんとした対策やろうとしても、やっぱり時間と財源がいるというネックがあるので、ダメですよということを言いたいわけですね。
Thank you very much, Professor Kawata. So please now let me turn to Mr. Holgert. So you have shown the benefit in investing in resilience. Then still many governments struggle with deciding from many competing development priorities, more so as a consequence of COVID-19. So how do you make a case for the integration of resilience, sustainability, decarbonization, etc. in recovery spending?
So this is an excellent point, because what we can show is that if you look at the full cost of an infrastructure, it's often much cheaper to invest a little bit more at the beginning to build better, and then you can save on maintenance, repairs, and operations along the lifetime of this infrastructure. But in many places, in many countries, what's most difficult to find is the upfront costs to build the infrastructure in the first place. And in many, many cases, people are ready to trade off and have higher repair and maintenance costs if it can reduce this upfront cost that's so difficult to manage. However, we showed that in total, the increased costs to build more resilient is relatively small. It's about 3% of the cost of infrastructure. So it can be very expensive for some pieces, like one bridge or one other system, but in total, it's not much more expensive. And to manage to do that, what's really necessary is to think of the resilience issues very early in project design. So what happens very often is you design everything, and then just before construction, you realize that you have a risk problem. And at this point, your only choice is to build bigger and stronger, and that is really expensive. If you think of resilience very early at the strategic place, for instance, you can build in a different location, or you can use different technologies, and this is where you can build more resilient, not always spending more on it. So the solution is more financing, but also more financing at the right time when we make strategic choices about infrastructure with a system thinking. And it's easy to say and difficult to do, and we're working really, really hard to help countries try to do that, but we are not underestimating the difficulties.
Thank you very much, Mr. Holgert. Professor Kawata, in relation to what you have just explained in terms of self-help and then cooperative help and then public help, I have received one related question from an audience. So please allow me to ask this question. Yes. Okay, so as we collect data on vulnerable populations in urban areas during COVID-19, is there any partnership system with NGOs? That is actually a question audience put. And then this vulnerable population is critical element in urban areas. And then you have also mentioned about this self-help and then cooperative help. So in addition to COVID-19, also compound disaster perspective, if you can reply to this audience in terms of any partnership system with NGOs, that would be great.
その前にね、社会インフラというものの考え方を少し変えなきゃいけない。なぜかと言いますと、これまでライフラインとかですね、そういったものが社会インフラというの中心になってるって言ってたんですけれども、最近の日本のですね、災害では、いわゆる制度資本といいますか、金融とか福祉とか医療とか教育の施設がですね、非常に大きな被害を受けている。で、これは実は非常に住民とですね、密接な関係があるんですね。で、今までのその土木工学的な社会インフラの考え方とはちょっとですね、性質の違うものなんですね。ですからやっぱり豊かな社会になるということは、私たちが今知っている社会基盤というものを、どういうふうにして、自助と共助と公助でやっていったらいいかっていうだけじゃなくて、その被害を受ける、その社会基盤そのものの考え方をですね、少し拡張しないと。すなわち、もっと住民のそばにあるですね、生活に密着したものに視点を移さないとなかなか豊かな社会にならないのではないかと思いますが。
Thank you very much. So yes, actually, we have been running out of time, very unfortunately. Since I asked 2 questions to Professor Kawata, so please allow me to ask one final inquiry request to Mr. Holgett. By using 1 minute, I'd like to request you to share your final message in 1 minute to the participants who I believe are addressing challenges posed by natural hazards and COVID-19 from various perspectives and from various professional positions. So if you could share your message to the audience, that would be great. Thank you.
Well, I think, and being very quick, I touched on it during my presentation. I think this COVID-19 crisis is very specific because it's a mix of a disaster with a very heterogeneous impact that is very difficult to measure. So helping people is not very easy. But as we move forward, it also merges with a more classical economic crisis that will stay with us for a long time. So I think we as professionals of disasters have to learn a lot because it can help us better integrate what we're doing with the quote unquote normal economic and development policy in countries. But I think we also have to make our voice heard because a lot of the mistakes we know we have made in previous disasters might be made in the same time now. And if we know about that, there is a responsibility of making our case very strongly.
Great. Thank you very much. That is actually all the time we have for our keynote session. I wish to thank our 2 distinguished keynote speakers for their fantastic presentation and also informative discussions. Thank you very much again, Professor Kawata and Mr. Holgett.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. So with that, I'd like to conclude our keynote sessions, and I'd like to do the transition to our first panel discussion. So it is my pleasure to open our first panel session, Building Back Better, Greener, and More Resilient in the Context of a Pandemic. I'm pleased to introduce our moderator and our panelist speakers. Mr. Rita Mizao is a recovery advisor ad interim of the Disaster Risk Reduction and Recovery for Building Resilience team with the United Nations Development Program. Rita is a post-disaster recovery practitioner with over 20 years of experience in the field of disaster recovery. We have 4 panelists in the panel. The first panelist is Her Excellency, Ms. Maria Alejandra Munoz Seminario, Vice President, Government of the Republic of Ecuador. Second panelist is Ms. Bambi Kraus, National Tribal Affairs Advisor, Federal Emergency Management Agency, Government of the USA. Mr. Vijay Padmanabhan, Director, Urban Infrastructure, Southeast Asia Department, Asian Development Bank. Mr. Joy Elemon, Director General, Kerala Institute of Local Administration in India. So, Ms. Mizao, you have the floor. I think the sound is not being aired.
Good day, everyone.
Yes,
thank you very much, Yuki, for that fine introduction of our esteemed panelists today. It's my pleasure actually to moderate this session. As you have seen and already heard from Yuki, we have a lineup of very distinguished and very highly qualified and experienced speakers to share with us their thoughts on the subject of building back better, greener, and more resilient in the context of a pandemic. I think the case has already been made very well with our keynote speakers, Professor and Stephen Halgate, who've talked about the key in investing in protecting of people, in making sure that recovery puts into dividends for long-term economic growth and prosperity in terms of being disaster resilient. We also heard a little bit about how people should be engaged in this process as well. So this discussion will take us more deeper into those few points that were made in the first panel discussion. As a lineup of our speakers, we've already heard about Her Excellency, the Vice President Munoz from Ecuador. She is 51st Vice President of Ecuador and has held earlier several important positions in the national government of Republic of Ecuador. She has a lawyer by degree, public law, business, tax, and human rights, but also a professor of administrative law. She, apart from the law degrees, in her law degree, she also has a master's degree in violence prevention, women inclusion, and psychology. Similarly, with other speakers, we have Ms. Bambi Kraus, the National Tribal Affairs Advisor from FEMA. She's worked as 19 years with the President in the National Association of Tribal and Historic Preservation Office, but right now she's an advocate for native rights, very, very critical work that she's been doing very recently. Our third speaker in line would be Mr. Vijaypin Padmanabhan. He's an engineer, urban planner with ADB, handling a large portfolio of $4 billion. Has been working there for more than 24 years, sorry. And he's been leading support also in implementing emergency and post-conflict assessment projects. And our final speaker will be Dr. Joy Elemon, Masters in Public Health, as well as a medical doctor. But his career has been mostly in the area of working with people, and right now is the Director General of the Kerala Institute of Local Administration, which has done some remarkable work in local self-governance and the management of the pandemic. So with that, I would like to actually invite that we have this line of panelists start speaking. For the first panelist, our Vice President has sent us a video message, and that will be aired first. Thank you, and over to President Munoz.
Es para mí un privilegio compartir este foro. Ecuador los saluda. Como lo he dicho en otras ocasiones, en medio de una tragedia nadie gana. Nos solidarizamos con el dolor y nos comprometemos con la esperanza en días mejores. El foro tiene por nombre Reconstruir mejor a partir de desastres. ¿Qué es reconstruir? Es reedificar, es rearmar. Y este desastre, porque es un desastre del COVID-19, no es un evento puntual al que normalmente los seres humanos atendíamos. Es una larga emergencia que empezó para seguir hoy entre nosotros y que mientras esté nos sigue enseñando cómo manejar crisis pero prolongadas. Quiero plantearles en este corto tiempo que tengo al menos 3 aprendizajes del Ecuador en medio de esta crisis. El primer aprendizaje es que las decisiones no solo deben ser correctas, tienen que ser oportunas. El 11 de marzo se declaró la emergencia sanitaria en el Ecuador y 5 días después, ya el Comité de Operaciones de Emergencia Nacional solicitó realizar un monitoreo de aquellas pérdidas en el sector productivo que estaba implicando la emergencia sanitaria. El 20 de mayo del mismo año 2020, el COE amplió la solicitud de evaluación al resto de sectores y solicitó utilizar la metodología Post-Disaster Needs Assessment, PDNA por sus siglas en inglés. Esta evaluación fue liderada por el Gobierno Nacional, apoyada por el Sistema de Naciones Unidas, Banco Mundial y Unión Europea, y analizó el periodo marzo, abril y mayo, que fueron los meses más críticos de la emergencia. Los resultados de la evaluación revelaron los efectos de la pandemia en el tejido social y en el tejido productivo. 6.420 millones de dólares en pérdidas económicas del sector público y privado. Impacto macroeconómico de 9.6% del PIB. Significativo aumento de personas viviendo en pobreza y pobreza extrema y en general en condiciones de vulnerabilidad. 240.000 desafiliaciones a la seguridad social ecuatoriana. Cerca de 900.000 personas afectadas por la caída de ingresos y la reducción de los salarios. Cierre de actividades económicas sobre todo lo que eran micro y pequeñas unidades económicas, afectando sobre todo a las mujeres y a los jóvenes. 12.5 millones de atenciones primarias de salud perdidas, no realizadas. afectando principalmente la salud de las mujeres, de niños, niñas y adolescentes, personas adultas mayores con discapacidad, personas con enfermedades catastróficas, aumentando así el riesgo de desnutrición crónica en niños y niñas menores de 5 años. Estos resultados, que son datos, que son hechos, fueron medidos a tiempo. Esto fue lo que permitió que se establezcan planes para desacelerar que se sigan profundizando esos daños. Porque los daños o los impactos de las crisis llegan en función de la condición en la que estás. No es lo mismo una crisis para una persona que tiene ahorros que una crisis para una persona que trabaja por lo justo. Y es por eso que una medición hecha a tiempo, una decisión no solamente correcta de medir, sino oportuna, nos permitió tomar acciones específicas para intervenir aquellas zonas del tejido social y productivo más afectadas. El segundo aprendizaje que les quiero compartir es priorizar es la clave y focalizar esfuerzos. De forma paralela a la evaluación, incluso cuando no teníamos resultados, el presidente de la República anunció sus prioridades: salud, alimentación, empleo y dolarización. Es decir, todos los esfuerzos de la función ejecutiva se dirigieron hacia esas 4 prioridades. Y en esa misma línea se remitió a la Asamblea Nacional la Ley Orgánica de Apoyo Humanitario, el 22 de junio del 2020, orientada, y lo voy a decir textualmente, a mitigar los efectos adversos dentro del territorio ecuatoriano para fomentar la reactivación económica y productiva del Ecuador, con especial énfasis en el ser humano, la contención y reactivación de las economías familiares, empresariales, la popular y solidaria, y el mantenimiento de las condiciones de empleo. La ley incluyó, entre otras medidas, no incremento a los costos en servicios básicos, la prohibición de suspender por falta de pago los servicios de agua potable, energía eléctrica, telecomunicaciones e Internet, la prohibición de terminar pólizas de salud, un plan de reactivación económica a través de créditos productivos, protección del empleo para el sector privado, revisión de tasas de interés para todos los segmentos, reprogramación de pagos por obligaciones con entidades financieras y de seguros. Es decir, este segundo aprendizaje, que es priorizar y focalizar esfuerzos, permitió que se tomaran acciones para desacelerar los daños medidos por una decisión tomada a tiempo. Y el tercer aprendizaje que voy a dejar es: nadie al costado de la vida, siempre en el centro el que menos tiene. Esta medición del PDNA nos permitió conocer exactamente dónde estaban las necesidades de intervención y de protección social con claridad. Es así como se creó el bono de protección familiar para beneficiar aproximadamente a 950.000 familias, el 88% de beneficiarios mujeres. Este bono fue ampliado luego a 2.315 familias más de las Islas Galápagos, profundamente afectadas por el impacto de la pandemia en el sector turístico. En cuanto a la lucha contra el hambre, se creó el bono de apoyo nutricional, que a través de una transferencia monetaria por una sola ocasión de $240, se facilitó el acceso a alimentos de más de 7.992 beneficiarios, familias con niños y con niñas. En cuanto a los índices de desnutrición crónica infantil, la Vicepresidencia de la República intervino en los 6 cantones más afectados del país, coordinó la atención de los cantones restantes con los distintos ministerios. En el mes de diciembre se aprobó ya la Estrategia Nacional Ecuador Crece sin Desnutrición, a efectos de garantizar el acceso al paquete priorizado de vacunas consejería para madres gestantes, niños menores de 5 años, así como su seguimiento nominal y un presupuesto atado a resultados que asegure para el Ecuador un futuro sin desnutrición. Los aprendizajes son extensos. He hecho un breve resumen de una hoja de ruta que se ha centrado en medición, acciones oportunas y protección. Antes de finalizar, quiero compartirles que hemos ya iniciado la segunda toma de evaluación PDNA, ahora con un corte a diciembre del 2020. Primero, para medir los resultados que por un lado tenemos con relación a las acciones tomadas, y por otro lado, para continuar enfocándonos en desacelerar los daños con precisión. El año 2020 y lo que va del 2021 no son años, meses o días cualquiera. Son los años, meses y días en que los líderes, tanto públicos como privados, estamos puestos a prueba y tenemos la responsabilidad de tomar las decisiones que puedan acelerar la recuperación de la vida de nuestros ciudadanos en el sentido integral de la palabra. Muchas gracias.
Thank you, Madam Vice President, for that very clear understanding of what the government can do and the slew of measures that the government of Ecuador has already taken to address the pandemic. I would like to encourage all the participants to please type in the questions which we will answer at the end of this other speakers. I now request the second panelist to take floor, Ms. Bambi Kraus, to speak. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Rita. And thank you to the host for organizing this session. Today, I'll be speaking on addressing impacts on vulnerable groups, specifically FEMA's work with American Indians. Next slide, please. It should be the slide with, I have to make sure I'm on the same page here. Perfect. So FEMA has organized an unprecedented response in terms of the COVID, and we have been working closely with the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. And what's important about the Department of Health and Human Services is that American Indians have a separate healthcare system under the Indian Health Service of HHS that American Indians have been working closely with during this pandemic. FEMA has been leading the response, the whole of government response on the COVID-19 response and recovery efforts, but we have been leading it with the Health and Human Services Department. As of the end of September, FEMA has obligated more than $50 billion to support the United States' COVID-19 response efforts. And we've also added an additional $44 billion in lost wages assistance. Most importantly, we've been partnering with government, state governments, tribal governments, nonprofit associations to work on reimbursing eligible costs. And at FEMA, we like to say that we are federally funding, but the state is managing the recovery. So that's an important distinction of FEMA is in Washington, D.C., we're providing guidance and finances, but we rely on the states and tribes to actually do the work at the local level. Next slide. I wanted to make sure everybody understood how FEMA is set up. It's regionalized into 10 different regions. There are American Indians in every one of FEMA's regions. The most are in Region 10, which is Alaska, and it says Seattle on there. Region 10 has more than 270 federally recognized Indian governments in that one region. 229 tribes are located in the state of Alaska. And that is where my mother is from Southeast Alaska. And I always like to point out where she's from. She's from Cake, Alaska. The next region that has the most tribes is Region 9, and that's California, Arizona, and Nevada. They have about 150 tribes. That also includes the headquarters for the Navajo Nation. The Navajo Nation is very large. It covers 3 regions of FEMA. We have worked out a unique relationship with the Navajo Nation because of the size and because of the pandemic's effect on them over the years, over the past year. Altogether, there are 574 Indian tribes in the United States. And I'll explain how we work with them in the next few slides. So next slide, please. So in terms of supporting tribal governments, the benchmark for FEMA in Washington, D.C. has been March 13th of 2020, when the President of the United States declared a national emergency. And every state and territory has been covered by that emergency declaration, but also they've received major disaster declarations. And so the tribal governments have the option of going with the state to request assistance, or they can request a major disaster on their own. But whatever the case, tribes are covered under FEMA's network of getting assistance at the local level. Next slide, please. This is a fairly lengthy list of broad descriptions that have, they're of course important because this is the topics and the idea of what FEMA has been reimbursing for the state, territories, and tribes. But these are broad descriptions. They're very specific applications of when these can be reimbursed. But I wanted to give you an idea of some of the things that FEMA has been supporting our locally driven response teams on the ground for the COVID crisis. Next slide, please. In terms of how FEMA is organized in working with tribes, we have a regional outlook. Again, you saw the map of the 10 FEMA regions. So the liaisons have been designated by headquarters. Each of the 10 regions has hired at least one person who is responsible for working with the tribes in that particular region. So this is a full-time job where they get to know the specifics of a tribal government because they're all unique. I think we currently have 200 existing Native American languages that are holding on to the thread of the last fluent speakers. Some tribes are doing a better job than others in terms of retaining their language and their culture. But it's a specialty within FEMA to actually be trained and experienced to go and set up relationships with the tribes in that region. It's a very specific skill, but it's a very important skill because of the uniqueness of tribal governments and cultures. So this is a list of the tasks and responsibilities that the tribal liaisons do. And we'll go to the next slide, please. This kind of gives you an idea of what happens on the ground. A lot of tribes have worked with their states more than they have worked with FEMA prior to the COVID crisis. So there has been a learning curve at the state, local, and federal levels of how to work with tribal governments. Again, is because of the uniqueness and the quantity, the number of unique tribal governments. Next slide, please. And I think this is the last slide, but it just mentions about resource procurement, and there's processes set in place. So for example, I am responsible for making sure that a tribal person is on, a tribal specialist is on staff to coordinate with other federal agencies, the response and recovery in Washington, D.C. And we fulfill all kinds of information requests. We work, again, closely with the Indian Health Service and other federal agencies in providing support, both financial and human support to the tribes across the country. So with that, that concludes my PowerPoint presentation, and I will take your questions at a later time. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And thank you for also finishing your presentation in time. It was very interesting to hear about the program that the US government has for tribal nations. Particularly, I think this has come very much to the fore in the pandemic. The conditions of the tribals, you mentioned the Navajo Nation, that was one that just highlighted very much in the media here about what has been the pandemic effect on the Navajo Nation completely. And so hearing from you the network of support from the federal level down to the local level. And I think the important point you raised about federal funds, but local action, locally led action, I think that's an important point that is applicable for recovery, whether it's in the pandemic or in a disaster or any other crisis. So it's funds, national resources, but local action. So thank you very much. And we will take questions, as you mentioned, at the end. And I now invite our next panelist, Mr. Vijay Padmanabhan, to speak on the subject of infrastructure and financial and resilience. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rita, and good afternoon to everyone back there. And I hope all of you and your families are safe given this pandemic that we're all experiencing. I'll speak on behalf of ADB's experience in terms of financing and building back better, and also the role of planning, which is important for us in terms of understanding infrastructure, but also looking at social and institutional issues. Go to the next slide, please. Just a quick snapshot here. If you could see this clearly, basically 4 in 5 people are affected by natural hazards in Asia. Between 2012 and 2018, ADB estimated that around $15 to $16 billion was lost annually due to natural disasters, and this accounted for almost 3 times the GDP of ASEAN countries. Next slide, please. Moving on, what I would like to do is basically touch upon building resilience. And by building resilience, we look at 3 critical areas. One is looking at financial. The second is to look at infrastructure. And the third, and probably the most important, is to look at social and institutional areas. Now, what I will do is basically try and touch upon each of these 3 points with some work that ADB is doing and some field examples of how we are addressing these issues. So first is basically looking at financial. If you could go to the next slide, please. When we look at financial, ADB has been traditionally supporting any disasters through what we would call as the emergency assistance loans. These loans are basically reactive. They are based on ADB's disaster and emergency assistance policy, and it's triggered once a natural disaster or a conflict occurs. And this has been more of a reactive response and financing. The second option is to basically look at providing concessional assistance for disaster risk reduction. ADB's got the Asian Development Fund, which looks at grant financing for what we call as thematic pools aligned with Strategy 2030 of ADB. And one of our operational priorities is to basically look at climate change, disaster risk management, and environmental sustainability. So there is a reasonable amount of set aside for governments for what we call as the poor and lower middle income countries that look at providing grant financing to address disaster risk resilience. And the third, which is more recently developed, is a part of ADB's policy-based loans, where we look at contingent disaster financing, where it's financing that's provided upfront, way ahead, in order to prepare governments for any disasters eventually. So if you go to the next slide, basically with the COVID response, ADB had prepared a package of about $20 billion to try and look at how we could be more responsive to governments when they needed to use these packaging. 2 loans that were provided, one to Indonesia and one to the Philippines, used the disaster or the contingent disaster financing modality, where we looked at preparing governments for addressing social protection investment in public infrastructure, disaster risk financing, and disaster risk reduction. These were basically rapid access loans within 0 to 90 days. That's immediately when the disaster occurs. And also in the specific case of the pandemic, once a national emergency has been declared, this could then be triggered off and financing could be made immediately available. One of the experiences from the pandemic has also been that livelihoods have been lost, and therefore how could governments actually respond to the loss of livelihood, especially in this region of ASEAN, where tourism is a very critical economy driver. Go to the next slide. What we've done is just presented to you the areas on urban development and water, where we are looking at in 3 specific areas: policy and planning, infrastructure and service delivery, and institutional effectiveness. Essentially, there is a short-term response, and then there are some on the long-term. More on the policy and planning, which takes a bit of a long-term view to try and address the frameworks, for example, on land use planning in cities. That would actually go a long way in terms of designing what cities are required to address in case of such pandemics, and more specifically looking at biodiversity. In terms of infrastructure and service delivery, a number of our water supply projects have been actually pretty much responsive to governments, and large-scale infrastructure is being designed and constructed to address continuous water supply. And lastly, on the institutional effectiveness, we've been looking at a lot of digital solutions, the application of mobile technology in addressing financial payments in terms of digital payments, and also looking at the satellite imagery and how we could use spatial imagery to actually drive our analysis. Moving on from here on the next slide is quickly to touch upon infrastructure itself. So the first area that we're looking at is in terms of planning and collaboration. Here we are trying to actually bring in a lot of knowledge partners, working closely with universities and think tanks to bring in the best of knowledge to take us forward. And an example I just mentioned is on the European Space Agency. The other two areas that we are touching upon is on climate change and biodiversity, providing us design features, and then on ecosystem-based adaptation. In Indonesia, so next slide, as an example, after the tsunami, the 2018 Central Sulawesi tsunami, we worked closely with the European Space Agency to build a lot of our analysis using satellite imagery, and actually even designing infrastructure and buildings and foundations using this information. One of the universities that we are constructing, there's a small red box up there close to the seashore, is also based on support that we're getting from the European Space Agency. And the last slide basically just touch upon, and what we feel is really a critical area is looking at social and institutional. So first is, of course, to look at disaster risk reduction, so to build it up into the systems, but also to try and look at livelihood restoration. So if you could just make 2 clicks so that we can look at those 2 areas. Yeah. And more importantly for us, livelihood restoration has been very critical. And as an example, the 2015, the next slide, please. The 2015 Nepal earthquake allowed us to provide support to rebuild schools, but we also had the access to financing to provide for microcredit and enterprises to look at improving their livelihood. A $7 million grant from ADB's Japan Financing for Poverty Reduction actually allowed us to work more closely with around 16,000 affected households to actually rebuild their livelihood. So that's an area that we also feel is critical, and also currently with the tourism economy being down, livelihood is something that we're trying to focus on. In conclusion, I guess more specific to the pandemic, and just moving to the last and closeout slide, is that we've been actively pushing for conservation efforts, looking at nature conservation, developing healthy oceans, and addressing what's required in marine protection, and also looking at water conservation. So irrespective of the situation, we are actively pursuing these 3 areas. I'll stop there. Thank you very much. And it's been a pleasure to be here with all of you, and we'll take questions later on. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Padmanabhan. I think very clearly stated the progress in which process in which ADB supports countries following a crisis, noting the short and long-term impact very well articulated in that particular slide, and as well as the 3 or 4 things that you would like to focus on, which is first finances, second infrastructure support, third is social and institutions, with a couple of examples that you gave from Nepal, Indonesia. I think resonate well also at the end when you mention about focusing on conservation and protecting, also beginning with what we started with this, the VP's presentation, the Vice President's presentations, where the focus was very much on social protection, and then coming to Dr. Krause's presentation, where she spoke very much about paying attention to native tribes who may otherwise may not receive all the benefits that the general populace would receive. Thank you very much for that. I now hand over to our final speaker for this panel, Mr. Joy Elemon. Joy Elemon, the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all. Let me start the title of my presentation would be The End of the Pandemic and Beyond, because we are talking about building back better, greener, and cleaner and all. So next. So I just wanted to say, next slide, please. Just wanted to say that from where I'm coming, it's Kerala, a province or a state in India, the southernmost part, well known for its development model, and we have a comparatively well-developed public health system and a strong local government system, and experience from a 25-year-old long People's Plan campaign, the local participatory planning exercise by the local governments. Next. And with regard to the stages of action, as far as the pandemic was concerned, it could be considered as endemic, epidemic, and finally it was pandemic. But then we in India declared it as a national disaster and a state disaster. So we approached it as a disaster. Next. So as part of the pandemic, naturally, as you can see, all those things which we all do, the isolation testing and contact tracing and physical distancing and treatment. And we also initiated the first line treatment centers outside the public health institutions, because we also had to unburden the public health system institutions also, and then the tertiary care. Next. I'm actually trying to focus more on the post-COVID situation rather than on these things, but I want to say that usually in the times of disaster for all of us, it's an emergency. It is like a war. We have to consider it as in a war-like situation. So there needs to be coordinated systems and coordinated efforts. As we say, uniformed and non-uniformed forces have to come together. And so naturally, it has to be a single point of command. So we say we need to have a command and control approach. And that is how our National Disaster Management Act and procedures say also. But also let us remember that in disasters, who is the first respondent, who knows the area, who understands the community, and who can reach the communities, and whom does the community know also is important. And that is where my next slide, that is where the local governments come in action, the subnational and finally the local governments. And here again, we started with the awareness generation of the Break the Chain campaign, then the rapid response teams in every ward in a local government, we call it panchayats and municipalities. Also regular daily updating of data, gathering details, monitoring the quarantine and the isolation. We actually interchangeably use isolation and quarantine and all, but practically it's about quarantine and isolation. And the food and support services, so that we decided that no one should be hungry during the time of lockdown and others. And that initiated the community kitchens by the local governments, and also specifically taking care of the vulnerable and the high risk. Especially we have a lot of migrant laborers coming into Kerala. So their issues, because they lost their jobs and they have to be also taken care of. And so daily stock taking and reporting and other things. And finally, as I said, the COVID first line treatment centers, which all happen at the local level, and the local governments have to be into action. Next slide, please. So, and this doesn't happen by themselves alone. They need to work together with the women's self-help groups, the health system staff, the accredited social activists, health activities, we call them the ASHA workers, the childcare center workers or the Anganwadi workers, and the volunteer teams, and the elected representatives and the officials. But basically I wanted to say was that it's all under the broad umbrella of the local government system, guided and supported by the state government. And it is basically, it is multi-level governance and action. Even though we say it's single point of command and action, we do it in a multi-level governance and action. Next slide, please. But Rome was not built in a day. In Kerala, we have a strong local government system, experiences over the last 25 years on local governance. Especially we had a massive floods during 2018. And that is when the local governments plunged into action, and people understood that it is the local government which can actually do these kinds of things. And so we had started preparing local action plan on climate change, as well as every local government was into preparing local disaster management plan in December 2019. And it is at that time that the COVID struck. But they had drafted the first draft of the local government led disaster management plan. This became handy for the COVID management also. And next slide. So when I say local government or a subnational government, it is not that everything is done directly by them. Different ways of doing, working with others. They plan, they do, they coordinate. In some cases, they lead. Some cases, they support. Some cases, facilitate, negotiate with other agencies for the people, or sometimes devolve, delegate, network with other agencies, and of course, the grievance redressal. So this is the different ways in which the local governments and the subnational government work. Okay, coming next slide. As we move on, there are all these primary recovery activities and other things, and continued surveillance and all. But basically, there is a knowledge, attitude, practice leading to behavior change. That is more important in this COVID situation. And it's not an individual change, but it's about community level changes which needs to happen. Finally, it is leave no one behind. Next. So as we move on, we need to address food security, short-term and long-term, poverty and hunger. That's also part of this. And employment and livelihoods, local economic development. We need to bring back the economy back at the local level. Land and water has to be considered, education, and of course the disadvantaged, the elderly and other vulnerable population. And we need to address climate change, disasters and other things. So there are the capacity challenges. Next. And as part of building back better, greener and more resilient, we have this no one to be hungry. And in that way, we have initiated under the leadership of the local governments and the women's self-help groups. We have 1,000 people's hotels and more, so that people are not from hungry. This is subsidized food, and sometimes it is free also. 5,000 clubs for the elderly across the state. Clean and greener Kerala. We have a mission specifically for that. Rejuvenation of canals and roads and canals and ponds and other things, and organic vegetation and other things. And as you can see, 10 million trees to be planted in a year. Local employment assurance program, where 5,000 new enterprises at the local level through skill mapping comes in. And solid and liquid waste management, education sector and palliative care and other things. And we have an initiative called Rebuild Kerala Initiative post the floods. And now we also have the Resilient Kerala program, where we address climate change and disasters. And next. And we need to strengthen our local disaster management plan and climate resilient plans to come in. So this is how we are trying to see the greener, better, resilient Kerala program. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Joy. Thank you very much for showing us what Kerala has done. I think as a state, they've been recognized to be far advanced in their approach to management of disasters, Nipah virus, and the floods, of course. And following that, the pandemic also, they seem to be right at the top of things. And sharing also the role specifically of the local governments, the panchayats. I'm also glad that you recognized and mentioned the role of Kudumbashri, Asha workers, Anganwadi workers, women who are on the front line, health workers. And I think they have contributed a lot in the management of the pandemic. And so recognizing that it was very good to see them mentioned in your PowerPoint presentation, along with also the approach that the government has taken in terms of supporting much more green Kerala. I was there in the Kerala 2018 floods to work there as a part of the response. And so I'm very glad to hear about the Rebuild Kerala initiatives, but also excited to learn that the local disaster management plans that the panchayats have developed have actually helped them in responding to the COVID-19. And so I think that's a big lesson for us. The more prepared we are with disaster management plans, we have seen across, whether it is US, I think Ms. Krause also mentioned it was Disaster Management Act that was come into fore, and emergency support was given through that. I guess so. That's, I think, more prepared the disaster management community is, the better we manage other crises as well. So using the same systems across other crises has been very useful. So thank you very much. Right now, I would like to open the floor for questions and discussions. We have a couple of questions already received. I think I would just like to request any one of the panelists to respond to these two questions, perhaps first, before I direct individual questions that are for the panelists. The first question that has come is any one of the panelists may choose to respond to this question. What are the strategies or mechanisms to support persons with disability in COVID-19 recovery? And that's one question. And perhaps I can tag the second question along, is that how do we ensure an inclusive and people-centered approach to recovery? But the first question is about what mechanisms do we have to support persons with disabilities in COVID-19? I request one of the panelists to respond to this before we go to the next slew of questions we have. Thank you.
If you don't mind, Rita.
Yes, go ahead, please, Ms. Krause.
Thank you. At FEMA, we also have people dedicated to working with people in different communities, including disabilities. It's probably not as deep as it is for the tribal community, but for federal law in the United States of America too, they have to accommodate as reasonable accommodation as available. So I just want to state that as a federal official and working for the federal government, that we have rules and laws that we have to fulfill.
Anyone else who want to respond to this as well? Dr. Joy?
Yeah. And just to add, our disaster management plan actually had specific sections on data, individual based, who all are there in which location and all on the differently abled people. So that was very useful. And during the COVID times, they were given focus. Where are they? What are their requirements and all specifically? And the volunteers and the local governments actually took care of such situations. And now, post-COVID or the moving ahead, our local government plans for the next year on actually has clear guidelines on taking care of the differently abled, especially whether they require scholarships, whether they require education, whether there's mobility issues. All these things have to be considered in the plans prepared by the local governments for the coming year. So that has already been released, and so that happens. And as you would know, we also have at the very local level, we have bud schools where we take care of the differently abled children by the local governments and the Kudumashri movement. So that's also there. So we are actually focusing on this, especially this. Recently, this was announced in the budget also, the state budget for the next financial year, again, focusing on differently abled post-COVID situation. Okay, thanks.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I think the fact that there's a budgetary allocation both within the FEMA as well as the government of Kerala, I think that's very encouraging to know. Finance is one important part of how do we ensure protection of people. I'd like to go to the next set of questions that we received, and most of them are directed at, one of them is directed at Ms. Krause. Can you share what are the COVID-19 recovery priorities of tribes, and what has been their role in implementing the recovery? And then would you say that COVID-19 has a positive impact on the cooperation of different tribes with FEMA? How has the relationship improved over this pandemic with the national agency?
Okay, that's a lot of small questions. Well, I think the most important thing is it highlighted how important the tribes understand how important it is to have a plan, an emergency plan in place. a lot of them have not had a disaster that required them to seek assistance from the government or work with FEMA. And overnight, they had to put together emergency teams, set up emergency operations center, things that other, the states that deal with disasters all the time, like Florida and hurricanes, they're used to a disaster happening all the time. So it highlighted at the tribal level the need to get to know and work with FEMA. I think at FEMA, response is that trying to get an understanding of how you work with 574 Indian tribes. There are only 50 states and 6 territories in the United States with 574 tribes that range from 2 people to more than 250,000 people. So there's been a challenge on both sides. I think the one thing that I'm not with you today to talk about this, but it also highlighted the vulnerability of American Indians and Alaska Natives in terms of pre-existing health conditions that were really exacerbated by the pandemic and the lack of good health care. So, it's been heartening to see, people coming together. And again, some tribes have managed to do well economically, but that's an exception. Most tribes are still looking to work with federal agencies as a fulfillment of what they signed away in terms of treaties hundreds of years ago. So there's very much an understanding that the government and the Indian tribes need to cooperate together. And that's one of my roles at the FEMA is to, bring people together and highlight issues and try and find solutions. So thank you very much.
Perhaps I might just want to ask the other question that I had, the minor question that you said. What did you see the recovery priorities of tribes themselves? What did they think about what should be done in terms of first, second, and third? What are the 3 most things that they wanted the government support for?
When I heard recovery, I thought of, past the current wave of the pandemic. So they're still dealing with the response. Some tribes are, because there's still major outbreaks. But I think that in terms of what are they really looking for, it's, again, just if a tribe has very few resources and they're getting overrun with the need for housing before the pandemic, you're just piling on, and this is not news to others, working with communities that, aren't well resourced. It highlights the need for general economic ventures and the ability to have access to capital. There's a lot of things that go into a recovery, but a lot of tribal nations are still building out their tribal governments. And so, for example, only in the past 10 or 15 years have they had access to actually any kind of cash because of the casinos in the United States. That's the only successful economic venture that's ever existed in the United States. That's only 20 to 25 years old. So there's, a 200-year history and only 25 years of actually, having the ability to organize a government, hire and train staff to, and then in the midst of this nation building, you have a pandemic hit that, can wipe out, those 20 years of economic success. Does that help explain?
Yes, the challenges, yes, a lot of the challenges, yes, that has come out. Thank you very much. I think there would be if there was a lot of time, then this would have been a very interesting subject to get into, discuss more. I'd like to now actually pose a few questions that have been asked to Mr. Padmanabhan. Mr. Padmanabhan, one key question is, what are the examples of policy reforms in DRR, social protection, public infrastructure, and disaster financing being discussed with member countries? We'll take that one question and perhaps one question that is there for Dr. Job before we summarize.
Thanks, Sita. Maybe just quickly on the key policy reform areas. One is, of course, in a number of our countries, we look a lot into decentralization. and therefore looking at how strong local governments are and looking at the planning and policy framework. More specifically, we've also been looking at, given the current condition in terms of land use planning from an urban space, how exactly are we going to look at rebuilding? These are areas, in terms of development control regulation, we're trying to see, how these could become a very integral part of the, urban landscape. The other one is also on affordable housing. And right now in India, we are discussing on a pretty important project in Tamil Nadu where we're looking at affordable housing. So that also becomes a part of this entire package. And in Indonesia and in Philippines in specific, we've also been looking at the use of, like I said, spatial technology and also looking at digital and mobile to look at data capture and actually look at something like what India has done with its Aadhaar system, where we're looking at national identity. So we're creating that also as a part of the support that ADB is providing through its different packages. Maybe just connecting back with the first question that you had on, how are we using a lot of our large financing packages to kind of get communities together to try and address some of the social issues. As part of our COVID pandemic response packages, we are actually looking at creating certain committees where we bring private sector and the civil society organizations together to actually identify solutions. So it's not just a one tranche payment, but it's also connected with a lot of these collaborations in the field. So I'll stop there.
Okay. Thank you. That's my warning the bell to summarize this and close the session. We have another interesting panel coming up. I'd like to thank the panelists, particularly also in absentia, the Vice President Munoz for very eloquently presenting the priorities of the government on focus on people. That was the key message that I got through her entire presentation, is the focus on people, people's livelihoods, the elderly, the people with disabilities, and the other pregnant women, and different slew of packages that they have developed for them. I think key points that she made, was that decisions must be quick, timely, and appropriate. And I think that's what resonated also in the presentation later on about the focus on vulnerable groups together, both with Dr. Joy's, focus on how Kerala responded to the pandemic, but also Ms. Krause's work with the tribes in the United States. Thank you, Mr. Padmanabhan, for your, very clearly short illustration of the long and short impacts of the crisis on people, that emphasizing that building resilience requires the 3 or 4 pillars, which is financing, infrastructure, institution building. Those are the critical points. And I thank you all again for your participation in the panel. Thank you also to IRP for inviting me to moderate this session. With this, I'd like to hand over to our host, Yuki. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rita, and then also for all panelists for this very informative and useful discussions. I think we have learned a lot from all the expertise and experiences shared by the panelists. So, with the conclusion of this panel 1, there will be now a short break while we set up for the second panel. So please stay with us. We will be restarting in 5 minutes. We will be starting around 16:25 in Japan time. We will be starting in actually a bit longer than 5 minutes. 6-7 minutes we will be having a break, and then we will be restarting around 16:25 in JST. So please stay with us. See you later. Welcome back to our participants from around the world. We have concluded our brief break, and then I'm now pleased to open the second and the final panel session, Practical Cases and Lessons for Sustainable Recovery from the Impact of Compound Disasters. I'd like to introduce our moderator and the panelist, Ms. Paula Albrito, the Chief of Branch, Intergovernmental Processes, Interagency Cooperation and Partnerships in the United Nations Office for Disaster Risk Reduction. In her current role, she supports intergovernmental processes in addressing disaster risk reduction, coordinates interagency efforts in supporting the Sendai framework implementation, and she builds on partnerships efforts towards risk-informed investment and actions. We have 4 panelists in the panel too. Mr. Malcolm D'Alessa, PDNA and Recovery Strategy Coordinator, Department of Strategic Policy, Planning and Aid Coordination, Office of the Prime Minister, Government of Vanuatu. Mr. Ronald Jackson, Head Disaster Risk Reduction of Recovery for Building Resilience Team, United Nations Development Programme. Mr. Mark Hoven, Undersecretary, Department of Finance, Government of the Philippines. Ms. Bernadia Irawati Chandradevi, Secretary General, Asia Pacific, United Cities and Local Governments, UCLG. Ms. Alibrito, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Ms. Matsoka, and thank you for introducing already this impressive list of panelists. This will allow us to go immediately to the substance of our session. I have the pleasure to moderate this panel, where we are going to build on the keynote speeches, but also on what heard in the previous panel. And in this regards, we are going to look into lessons learned from assessing social and economic impact, as well as planning and financing a sustainable recovery. And we will address key issues for vulnerable and excluded groups. Consider also implication and measures for managing compound risk from the pandemic and the natural hazards. So without any further ado, and allowing us to pass comments and receive and respond to questions, I would like to give the floor to Mr. Malcolm D'Alessa. Mr. D'Alessa, the floor is yours.
Yeah. Thank you, moderator, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. I'm very much pleased to present Vanuatu's early recovery lessons, especially with what we've faced with Tropical Cyclone Harold and COVID-19 pandemic as well. Next slide, please. Now, just in terms of context, Vanuatu is a small developing country with a high disaster risk profile. We're very much exposed to a range of hydrometeorological and geophysical hazards. And we were hit by Tropical Cyclone Harold in early April last year. And with COVID-19 in the backdrop, especially with the declaration of a global pandemic in March, that added a new dimension for Vanuatu, especially given we faced regularly cyclones, that COVID-19 added another dimension. Total effects that were measured, especially for those 2 particular disaster events, amounted to $617 million in losses and damages. The tourism and service sectors were particularly hard hit, and it's important to note that, especially for COVID-19 losses, that only were accounted for during the period of March and June, and we know it's an ongoing crisis, the extent of which is still unfolding, especially for us. And early last year as well, we were in the midst of an election and transition of power. You had a state of emergency, which was also in place at that time. Next slide, please. Especially with assessing impacts, we initially grappled with whether to do separate assessments for Cyclone Harold and COVID-19 or have separate plans. And then with COVID-19 as well, that meant, especially for a small island developing state with limited capacity, not having your usual international search capacity that you normally accorded to, particularly to carry out post-disaster needs assessment and recovery planning compared to past disaster events. For example, in 2015, we had tropical cyclone Pam, which hit the country, and we had search capacity from international agencies to help us. And this time around, it's more the reliance on local and in-country capacities. We had mixed absorptive capacity, especially to effectively carry out assessments. For some sectors or clusters, they're in better shape than others. Some not in that good of a shape, so that impacted on delay of assessments. The other thing that the lesson was that with sectors having either minimal baselines or nothing at all, non-existent baselines, and as well as ineffective information management systems. So that also meant that delays in assessments or how we can deliver timely assessments or interventions. Having said that, we did have excellent remote support from international agencies, something that was a first for us, having to do remote support, and the UN, World Bank, bilateral donors particularly helped in that aspect. Next slide, please. Now, in July, we had a recovery strategy that combined Tropical Cyclone Harold and COVID-19. The recovery strategy makes explicit linkages with our National Sustainable Development Plan, which is our long-term development framework. The three main objectives with this particular strategy are firstly to restore and strengthen essential social services and protections, enhance lives and livelihoods, and repair the natural and built environment. So currently, sectors and donors are aligning their plans and budgets to that particular recovery strategy and its objectives. We also see that you have an emergence of recovery mechanisms or coordinating mechanisms at the subnational level, which previously that wasn't the case. It's more having to rely on the national level capacities. Having said that, at the Prime Minister level, at the central coordination level, recovery functions is something that is new. So we've only had a structure that was approved and established early last year, and there still needs to be substantive capacities and institutional strengthening to be undertaken. As well, we do have a current Disaster Risk Management Act as far as legal frameworks is concerned, but that doesn't explicitly cover recovery, so to speak. Next slide, please. And when it came to financing, the government reprioritized budgets, especially after TC Harold hit. So you had sectors that were able to deliver early interventions. Through the Ministry of Finance, an economic stimulus package was announced to support local businesses and small medium enterprises. The reaction currently has been mixed. You have businesses that have been very much appreciative of the support, especially tourism, given its wide major contribution to the economy, but there's still remaining frustrations. If you go to the next slide, please. And this was something that is linked to this lack of baselines that I've mentioned earlier, and not having proper registration licensing mechanisms. So you have the small and informal businesses missing out, and that means as well as your low income sectors of the community that are involved in businesses. Currently, our aid coordination unit at the Prime Minister's Office is working with donor partners to come up with direct financing agreements. And a Council of Ministers has, in September, established a recovery trust fund as a common decision, but this is yet to be operationalized. Next slide, please. Now, as far as next steps and ways forward, we're now having to work with recovery project proposals for funding, strengthening your coordination mechanisms, streamlining your financial processes. And we see that the TC Herald, Cyclone Herald recovery projects will be an opportunity for economic stimulus, especially economic recovery from COVID. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Daleza, for this important reflection and presentation from Vanuatu. Really enjoyed the consideration you made in terms of viewing and see the recovery strategy in terms of explicit linkages to the long term for the national sustainable development plans. And also very interesting to see that sectors and donors are beginning to align activities and budgets with the set of activities that have been highlighted. Also very much appreciated the fact that you have highlighted what are still the challenges to be faced, although you have identified a solution, in particularly the streamlined financial processes that are still needed and will need to take place. Thank you very much for this enriching presentation. And now I would like to pass the floor to Mr. Ronald Jackson.
Thank you, Paula. Distinguished panelists, distinguished participants, I am pleased to share UNDP's perspectives on its experiences and lessons in responding to COVID, particularly focus on the lessons from the recovery process. I will do so by articulating perhaps seven key lessons, some of which are reconfirming things we've known, and as Paula said in our opening, may also link back to those comments made in the opening presentations by Professor and Mr. Algate. My presentation will essentially build upon our experiences in rolling out the COVID recovery needs assessment, the socioeconomic impact assessments, and of course, the socioeconomic response plans that were developed. Next slide, please. And these were all led by UNDP, but certainly reflected within the spirit of partnership with a number of international organizations, and more importantly, the government. What we've seen in rolling out these assessments, that this was the first time that many countries were having to adapt a traditional approach using the PDNA methodology to address the particular challenges that COVID presented. And in several of these countries, the assessments were conducted to look at the impact of the pandemic, but also looking at it from an angle of the multidimensional nature of risk, given the number of other hazards and risks that were in play in many of the countries, some of which unfolded, and you would have heard from our colleague, Mr. Daleza, on his experience in that regard. Each assessment covered multiple sectors and key issues. And in fact, the assessments looked on the formal and informal sectors, small and medium enterprises, as well as MSMEs and tourism. This certainly was used to facilitate the pivot into the framing of the necessary economic recovery approaches. It is important to note here that the assessments also took a deeper dive into some of the social related issues, and this came up certainly in Mr. Halgate's very impressive presentation, where we looked at social protection programs of many of the countries, looking at the gaps in the social protection systems, the planned expansion for some of these systems, as many countries had some existing but needed to be expanded to deal with the COVID issues. Recognizing that we didn't want to leave those who are often left behind out of the process. Next slide, please. In terms of the first lesson, all the socioeconomic assessments conducted by UNDP revealed that social protection, jobs, livelihoods, and inequalities were the key issue that were again brought into sharp focus, reminding us that the underlying drivers are still left unaddressed, and it is the basis on which many of these types of crises superimpose themselves and can be so hard felt by poor individuals. Additionally, a strong unifying theme was the leaving no one behind. Vulnerabilities, exclusion, discrimination, and the effects of pre-existing inequalities that exacerbated COVID-19, the impact of COVID-19, were seen. Each assessment delved into the impact on vulnerable people, people with disabilities, women, migrants, refugees, as well as people who were incarcerated. We found that women were disproportionately affected by COVID-19. Women's jobs are 1.8 more times vulnerable than men's jobs, according to McKinsey and Company. And of course, this was brought out certainly when we looked at the sectors that were hardest hit by this event. Women, as you know, are largely employed within the accommodation and food sectors. And of course, they face the burden of unpaid care. The data also showed that violence against women and girls intensified during the period of lockdown brought on by the pandemic. Violent partners used confinement to further exercise control, while women were confined in homes and had fewer opportunities for exiting. So, colleagues, again, as we've seen in many other types of disasters, women have been disproportionately affected by this particular pandemic. It is felt that over 100 million people will be forced into extreme poverty at the end of 2020. Of course, we will have an opportunity to confirm that. This comes out of a report from UNDESA in 2020. Next slide. This is just, again, underscoring a comment made by the keynote speakers. Here you will see in South Africa the fact that the poorest provinces were hardest hit by this pandemic. And you were able to look through to see the numbers there in terms of what poverty levels existed, the state of food insecurity, income loss, and how this really led to a significant impact in South Africa, one of the countries in which we provided the assessments. Next slide. Our second lesson, there was a big recognition of the pre-existing vulnerabilities and risks that contributed to devastating impacts of the pandemic. Therefore, risk cannot be treated in isolation. A multi-sectoral, multidimensional, and potentially a systems approach will be required to better understand risk, the interaction of risk, in order to reduce present and future risk. And I've shared with you a nice graphic there of this interplay. Next slide, please. Lesson 3, and this looks at the fluid nature of COVID-19. We often talk about the protracted nature of crisis. This certainly has been one of those events that have been protracted, unlike traditional disaster events, which are episode. This is ongoing. And the crisis, the COVID recovery needs assessment are providing us only a snapshot in time, noting that the crisis is protracted and that the impact will continue to evolve over the numerous waves and adjustments governments have to make. Hence, the assessments will need to be revisited as countries face these different waves or surges. An example, in the case of South Africa, after the second virus variant, borders are closed and measures to contain the virus means that response is again on the top of the agenda of the government and neighboring countries. Recovery will therefore be slow. This implies a greater investment in early warning, preparedness for response, and preparedness for recovery, with systems, institutions, human resources, and flexible finances to support a circular nature of managing this response and recovery. Each recovery provides an opportunity for strengthening disaster resilience. The case for investing in disaster mitigation is made clear. Next. Again, lesson 4. The case of regional interdependencies were being observed here. Recognizing this interdependence, the African Union, in partnership with UNDP's Sahel Resilience Building Program, is working with regional intergovernmental organizations to develop a regional recovery framework from COVID-19. The objective of the regional framework is to guide inclusive socioeconomic recovery efforts at the continental, regional level in support of national recovery efforts in the AUC member states. This will be a joint effort of 6 regional intergovernmental organizations. Next slide. Lesson 5. Here, the discourse around systemic risk is no longer one of a theoretical discourse. Governments, private enterprise, civil society, and citizens are all now painfully aware of the fragile nature of the systems they depend on. The assessments allow governments to understand the interplay between social and economic and natural systems in building their resilience, and of course, the necessity of systems to adapt and gain resilience to the pandemic, disasters, and climate as well. Some are calling for a reset, a pivot of their existing development pathways to new pathways. Next. And here on the screen, we have a case of Azerbaijan, who, noting from those lessons, have focused their recovery strategy on these 3 key areas, looking at a new social contract, closing the digital divide, and of course, promoting green transitions for recovery. Next slide, lesson 6. Here, we saw that successful recovery requires a fit-for-purpose governance system. And we saw where in some of our countries, a solidarity fund was created, and this is the case in South Africa. The fund was designed as a rapid response vehicle to mobilize South Africa in the fight against COVID-19 and the resulting health and humanitarian and social consequences, having received in excess of 3 billion rand in the form of donation. Fund works to augment the government's response to the unprecedented challenges of COVID. Colleagues, recovery efforts require an all-of-society approach with coordinated and complementary actions across sectors and stakeholder groups, going beyond disaster management institutions to sectoral ministries and agencies, as well as non-state actors such as academia, civil society, and the private sector. It requires diverse financing arrangements to help sustain long-term recovery. And my final lesson, lesson 7. Countries, next slide please. Countries more than ever are now aware that their poor investments in healthcare, education, and social protection systems reduce their ability to bounce back from this crisis. As a result, each country's recovery strategy emphasizes recovery from the crisis should be green, therefore enabling green transitions as we heard before, invested in social aspects, focus on the most vulnerable, and this was the case in Azerbaijan, South Africa, Ecuador, and El Salvador. COVID itself is a unique chance to address climate change through the economic recovery process that integrate green transitions and investments such as renewable energy, smart buildings, and public transport with significant co-benefits in terms of jobs. Next slide. In conclusion, I've shared there with you a quote from Pedro Anceso, UNDP lead author of the Human Development Report. And this quote essentially implies that greater investment in early warning preparedness for response and preparedness for recovery with systems, institutions, and human resources, and flexible financing to support the circular nature of managing risk is of utmost importance and a requirement going forward if we're to face the future of uncertain risk. Thank you, Madam Moderator.
Thank you very much, Ronald, for sharing these precious 7 lessons learned. The lessons really tackled in a comprehensive manner the need to address risks that are systemic, requiring therefore fit-for-purpose governance system, as you alluded to, with strong coordination among sectors and stakeholders, which is something that was also mentioned by Mr. Also very important, the reflection you had, as already made by the keynote speaker from the World Bank, on the fact that disasters affects people differently, with the poor paying the heaviest toll in this already tragic dimension. So Ronald, thank you very much for your richness in conveying to us the key messages. And now I would like to pass the floor to Mr. Mark Hoven. Mr. Hoven, the floor is yours.
Okay. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to discuss today the Philippine experience in moving towards a resilient and sustainable economy post-pandemic. 2020 has been excruciatingly difficult. When the COVID-19 pandemic hit, the Philippine government quickly took stock of the situation and responded with everything we had. Next slide, please. Our priorities are clear: to save lives and protect our communities. We immediately put together a 4-pillar socio-economic strategy that aims to provide emergency support for our vulnerable groups and individuals, strengthen our health sector, ensure the safety of our frontliners, and implement fiscal and monetary actions to finance emergency initiatives and keep our economy afloat. However, these measures, as expected, have taken a toll on our economy. Next slide, please. It's fortunate that when the pandemic hit, we were financially ready. We had sufficient fiscal headroom to finance and ramp up public spending due to our prudent fiscal management. Since 2016, we had been pushing for game-changing reforms to strengthen our country's fiscal and economic position. The enactment of the Tax Reform for Acceleration and Inclusion in 2017 simplified our tax system, increased our revenues, and reduced personal income taxes for 99% of our taxpayers. We are also the only administration in the country's history that has increased sin taxes thrice within one presidential term. With better tax administration and robust revenue flows, our tax effort reached 16.1% of GDP in 2019, the highest in 22 years. In 2020, we managed to collect revenues amounting to $59.2 billion despite the challenging circumstances. This is just 0.4% lower from our total collection outlook for the year. Next slide, please. Likewise, our credit ratings have endured a global tide of downgrades and remained at historic highs. In fact, the Japan Credit Rating Agency upgraded us from BBB+ to A- in June 2020 at the heat of the pandemic. Just recently, Fitch Ratings kept the Philippines investment grade credit rating of BBB with a stable outlook. With our strong creditworthiness, we were able to quickly access emergency loans from our development partners and the commercial markets at very low rates, tight spreads, and longer repayment periods. As of January 11, 2021, a total of $14.26 billion in budget support and project financing has been secured to strengthen our COVID response efforts. Next slide, please. We have achieved another milestone with Congress passing the CREATE bill late last year, even amidst a very difficult time. This is the largest stimulus package for private enterprises in our country's history. CREATE provides an outright 10 percentage points cut from 30% to 20% in corporate income tax rates of domestic corporations with a net taxable income of 5 million pesos or around $104,000 and below. This also expands the role of our Fiscal Incentives Review Board to oversee the grant of incentives and ensure that they are performance-based, time-bound, targeted, and transparent. Another proposed bill called the Financial Institution Strategic Transfer Bill has been ratified already by both chambers of Congress and is awaiting presidential approval. This bill will enable our banks to offload their soaring loans and assets through asset management companies so that they could extend fresh credit to businesses in need of assistance during this very difficult time. In addition, the timely enactment of the government's $93.7 billion 2021 national budget will provide sufficient resources to ensure the recovery of our economy. The recent passage of the majority of our key economic reforms is crucial in our bounce back plan in order for us to emerge stronger after this crisis. Next slide, please. If you recall, 2020 started with the eruption of the Taal volcano, which wreaked havoc in many communities south of the national capital. Soon thereafter, we encountered a series of powerful typhoons in quick succession. This caused massive damage to many parts of our country, claiming dozens of lives and damaging properties and livelihood. Our recent experiences highlight the urgent need to quickly and decisively act on this climate emergency. Every year, we are losing billions due to the destruction caused to agriculture, livelihood, and infrastructure, among others. Although we are among the countries with the lowest carbon emissions, our country has been highly vulnerable to the disastrous effects of climate change, particularly typhoons. The enormous costs inflicted by these severe weather events hampered the country's overall economic recovery. Next slide. Hence, the Philippines constantly aspires to achieve the perfect balance between the need for sustainable climate action and the pursuit of economic progress. Over the past years, the Philippine government rolled out numerous initiatives for climate change adaptation and mitigation, disaster risk reduction, and sustainable development. Some of our ongoing initiatives include the National Climate Change Action Plan, the Philippine Catastrophic Risk Model, the Framework Strategy on Climate Change, and the National Asset Registry System. We also have the People Survival Fund, which is basically a fund that provides money to local government units for their programs and projects on climate change adaptation. We'd also like to thank Japan. We'd like to take this opportunity to thank Japan for quickly disbursing another disaster response loan amounting to 10 billion yen earlier this month to assist families and areas affected by recent typhoons that hit our country before 2020 ended. Next slide, please. As the new economy emerges from the pandemic, we aim to mobilize investments in renewable energy, sustainable urban planning, and climate-smart agriculture. The moratorium on endorsements for greenfield coal power plants and the opening up of the geothermal sector to greater foreign investments are a confirmation of the government's strong resolve towards sustainable development. The Philippines commits to put in place a science-based climate risk management system that will underpin our country's socio-economic plans and programs. We are also committed to deploying financial tools to build resiliency from household to the national level. Next slide, please. Even as we transition to more sustainable economic activities, the Philippines will sustain calls for broader international climate justice. Protecting communities in climate-vulnerable countries like the Philippines must become a global effort. Rest assured of our country's commitment to join the family of nations in a collaborative effort to address this climate emergency. We must work hand in hand as we aim towards a resilient and sustainable recovery post-pandemic in order to provide the best possible future for our people. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Hoven, for reflecting on the national financial dimension and perspective of disaster and recovery. Also reflecting on the importance to address risk as part of key economics reform that is crucial in order to be able to bounce back. Your presentation also shows how inspiring to a sustainable green and climate-aware development that can be turned into practice through the support of key economic reform and financial tools. So thank you very much also for sharing with us this important inspiration for your government and for all of us. And now I would like to turn to the last speaker, Dr. Tandal Devi. Dr. Tandal Devi, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Very good afternoon, very good morning, very good evening. And it's really a pleasure for me to join this important gathering. And thanks, of course, to UNDRR for inviting me. And since we are still in the mood of New Year, let me also wish everyone here a belated, a very happy New Year. And I also hope that everyone's resolution, New Year resolution, will be accomplished. So let me share here what the experience we have dealing with this disaster and also COVID-19. I will be speaking from the perspective of local governments. I hope my slide is shown here. Yes, okay. Thank you, because I cannot see both sides. Okay, so yes, I think when you see the outline of the presentation, I will be covering several aspects here, and I hope the time will be sufficient. So I will be speaking a little bit about solidarity, and also the second part is about UCLG Decalogue from the COVID-19 aftermath, and practices from local governments on the COVID-19 recovery initiatives. There are so many case studies that have been collected, also have been shared. And then 4 and 5 related to recommendations and the way forward towards a new adaptive era. And then in the next slides, basically when we see, if you are very familiar with the Japanese character of crisis, it has two Japanese letters or Chinese letters. One is showing a danger, and the other one is opportunity. So I'll be speaking here, despite this crisis, there are huge opportunities. So I'll be speaking more about what local governments have been doing in facing this COVID-19 pandemic, as well as some of the lessons learned that we can take from those initiatives. So what in the slides show that during this COVID-19, the solidarity of local governments and cities have been very, very high. I think this is quite interesting. A lot of cities also provide donations. When you look at these slides, that came from a city of Xi'an to Iriga, they said that a friend in need is a friend indeed. So the mayors also do not feel that they are alone. And what the role of UCLG aspect here is that we match between cities and local governments that can provide offers or support, and match with cities or local government that require support. So in the next slide here, we have been also collecting several case studies, document smart practices, and facilitate dialogue, not only among local governments and cities, but also different stakeholders. That's also include bridging local governments and central governments, because we see during these situations, you really need to have decisions that are quick, and also, of course, that are appropriate and can also be understood by the people, especially since COVID-19 really affecting people. So the communication tool has also become quite important aspects to see. So we also develop what we call it a quick guide or lessons learned. Of course, it can be accessible in our website. And also conducted various discussion forums. I think more than 30 we have conducted. And also we conducted sessions that link between COVID-19 and SDGs. And we have seen very strongly on that aspects. So in the next slide here, in a UCLG Decalogue on the COVID-19 aftermath, what the message that come from the mayors basically are very clear. We have the opportunity to not return to the previous normality. And I think this is a good chance and good opportunity to looking at also in the way we want to design our cities, we want to design our society, and also, of course, see the brighter future. So in these 10 recommendations, there are several aspects that come out, guaranteeing public services, financial support packages, models for global consumption and production, and worldwide Green Deal, and etc. And there are also more than 658 initiatives that have been uploaded in the website of UCLG and Metropolis, and they are covering 34 countries. So in the next slide here, some of the examples. And what interesting is that I like the presentation what the Philippine mentioned, that because you are already resilient, and there are a lot of initiatives actually that came already before COVID. And then that become also a good lesson that inspires others as well. So for example, the IRIGA supply chains, because we understand that during COVID, supply chains for having food resiliency has also been considered as high. So basic goods on the wheel in IRIGA city actually started long time ago. I mean, because the city faced a lot of typhoons, and this has been also conducted during this COVID-19 and has inspired many other cities. So set up the kitchen, entire kitchen in Patiala, India, as well as economic and stimulus packets, safety net programs in Jeonju City in Korea that also inspires others and also has been mentioned by the president of South Korea. And Jeju has also initiated several outbound on the open space tourism in new normal era for domestic hiking, biking. So they have a changing on the lifestyle as well. And in terms of community engagement, grassroots voluntary Jogotongo neighborhood initiative in Central Java, Indonesia. And we have seen similar things also in Malaysia. Another one also data synchronization that has been also a big deal, a big issue, because you can have optimal safety net programs if you have a very good data. And another one that's shifting also the way local governments do, and they also take this as opportunity, is transforming into from traditional market into online base, especially small medium enterprises that have also employed a lot of women. And in Indonesian case, less than 10% actually SMEs have connected to digital markets. So that's the opportunity. And many cities, and we have also public space project that connect digital market on that, working with the farmers. So in the next slide, here in terms of local initiatives to recover from the pandemic, we have also transforming the transport sector to be more environmentally friendly in the aftermath of the COVID-19. But maybe gentleman from Philippines also can correct me that Manila is now building the biggest bicycle lane in the city. I think this is great opportunity, and also Jakarta is expanding the bicycle lane as well, because there's we see transformation as the result of the COVID-19. And we also produce a quick guide on fighting against COVID-19, looking at the importance of how we deal with the public transport system. And in the next slide, the post-disaster and COVID-19 recovery initiative, this is a case of Palu city. If you're very familiar with this case of Palu, was hit by major natural disasters, a quake, tsunami, and liquefaction in 2018. And with support of this local government association in France, we launched a solidarity call for Build Back Better, and also focusing on the recovery phase, such as using learning, building public facilities, and supporting and others. So let me conclude here with some recommendations. I think the recommendation for mid and to long-term recovery, cities are the key to the post-pandemic growth. I think we really have to think the way our city looks, looking also building cities that also looking at the ecosystem, looking at the cities that are more compact and have a commuter-friendly and green. And greater decentralization and also empowerment of local government. We see this also effective kind of ways to have responsive governance, because if the local governments have a clear mandate in terms of their authority, or they have the authority, they will be able to do better. So in the last slide, takeaways, partnerships and collaboration. And I think in these situations, local governments cannot do alone. We need to mobilize resources beyond the local government's budget, and we really have to be creative on this. And to have to build back better, I think is if we want to win, or we want to win in these conditions, potential losers and winners will depend very much on how quickly we can adapt in the new adaptive era, a condition where we will live with the existence of COVID-19. But the important aspect here is partnerships. I think we have seen very clearly strong collaborations, for example, among businesses and with governments, local governments, and also important of integrated approach to ensure co-benefits. And I think I also want to repeat what the World Bank speaker mentioned, that to build resiliency, you really need to invest in building infrastructure system that only costs 3% extra of overall investment needs. So thank you very much for your attention. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bernardia, and thank you very much for the richness of your studies and examples, pointing out as policy measures and investments in cities are grounded in the commitment to sustainability, and how this will help not only the COVID-19, but also enable the region to pursue its sustainable development and address climate change. Also very important, the point you made on partnership and collaboration, as well as the integrated approach to ensure benefits. So now we have very, very few minutes in order to start our interaction session. We have received a lot of interesting questions for all of you panelists. You trigger a lot of reflection. So I will ask you really to spend 1 minute for each of the questions so that we can hear from all of you. Ronald, there's been a question addressed to you related to data. What are the critical data and information needed to make informed policy decisions and measures for resilient progress? Over to you, Ronald.
Thank you, Paula, and thanks for the question. That's a very important and perhaps tough question, because when you look at the multidimensional nature of risk, you want to ensure that you have a comprehensive data set on the people because they're most affected. So in all facets, the demography, the poverty indices, etc. But also on sectors, the various sectors that are interacting within that particular space. What I would say also is that it's good to be able to use that for foresight and to do integrated analysis. So I note 1 minute, so I leave it there, but I think a data set that allows you to overlap social as well as physical and environmental data sets to make informed decisions.
Thank you very much. And Malcolm, there was a question also to you related to data. You already mentioned in your presentation the importance of data in terms of addressing baseline. But what is, in your view, the advice that you can provide when there is an ineffective information management system?
Yeah, thanks. That's a tough question. It's sort of a chicken and egg situation, but I think you really need to start those building blocks to ensure there's a culture of ensuring your information is being collected, and it's you harness that particular information management system and you build from that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And now we go over to Howen. Quick question for you too. Have the COVID-19 pandemic and recent natural hazards changed how your agency approaches disaster risk financing? You already alluded to it. Any key element that has emerged that you can convey?
Actually, our general strategy has not changed, but with the COVID pandemic happening in the same year as a major volcanic eruption, as well as various typhoons, actually we see that moving forward, the climate risk and challenges are increasing. So we basically need to find new solutions. That's why we're actively working with the World Bank, the UN agencies, and the ADB in primarily Japan to develop or craft new products to ensure that we're insured or insulated against this worsening climate catastrophe or climate emergency. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this feedback. And now, Bernardo, a question to you. What do you think is the role of voluntarism and civil society in rebuilding communities after disasters in urban settings?
Can I also answer the question related to data, because this is actually extremely important?
Absolutely. If you can keep it in 1 minute and a half.
No, because the national data will also require a good local data. And we see this, and this COVID-19, we also see that there are new data that not available, like there's information about the job losses. So what we have done actually is we require local governments to create a local data hub that has transparency and also quick, because you have to collect that information and then connect it to the central data. And the effort of Indonesia to build one data at the national level, that also has started. I think this is important, but need to be keep updated. And the voluntarism, second question that you have about voluntarism, we have seen very, very huge during this COVID-19, because we basically see that there is still humanism spirit, and it's not lost during this COVID-19. We see also how the people even look after the neighbors, and they never done it before. And they provide the food, they provide whatever they have. And what is interesting, young people, I think many of them also have initiated a lot of quite interesting initiatives. For example, they created this look after society through the social media and through the website. But we found in one of the website sessions that they didn't get the support from local government. So we tried to connect those local initiatives that came from the NGOs or the community groups with local governments. That's what the contribution we could do at this moment. And another one also about this voluntarism, because there is also a little experience in which some people move back to the rural sites, because they couldn't find food in the city, they couldn't even, get a job. So they started this kind of, digital market. They also started some of the initiative using ICT. So that's created also some jobs. So it's quite interesting. I think it's good to also study whether after COVID people will tend to come back again to cities or not. But experts say that they might come back to the cities. But if we can give opportunities, good enabling environment in which you can have a very strong broadband, you have a strong, infrastructure. I'm talking about ICT, telecommunication. I think people will be happy also to settle down in the rural side. But of course, you have to give another services which is related to health, related to education. So we cannot just depend only on the ICT. So I think I hope it's answered that question. Thank you.
Very well. Thank you very much, Bernardia. We're coming to an end to our panel, and I would like to highlight very succinctly some common elements that I believe I heard emerging through this enriching and various examples provided by our panelists today. First of all, the need to set a long-term vision in recovery, contributing and align with SDGs, the climate change, and the risk reduction agenda. There is a common understanding that risks are systemic, therefore requiring fit-for-purpose governance system with strong coordination among sectors and stakeholders, and where data and availability of data is fundamental. Well-structured recovery plans allows for sectors and donors to align activities and budget, and also the strong value of partnership and collaboration beyond the national level and institution. But we also received an inspiration on how to achieve the perfect balance between the need for green sustainable climate action and the pursuit of economic progress when supported by key economic reforms and risk-informed financial tools. And mostly a very important word that we heard from Bernardia's presentation, solidarity. We need it more than ever as individuals and as a global society. Let me thank the panelists for sharing these important lessons and way forward in sustainable recovery from pandemic and compound disasters. Ms. Matsoka, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Arborito, for your great moderation. I also would like to thank to all the panelists for sharing your great expertise and experiences with our audience, and then for another very interesting interactive discussion. Thank you very much again. So before we move into the closing session, we'd like to invite our participants to join a second poll, like we did at the beginning of the forum. So this is to help us to hear a little from you about your takeaways from this forum. So I will post the poll now for 10-20 seconds. so that you can join this poll. So let me read the question. How should we plan for recovery to reduce the impact of future pandemics and compound disasters? And then please choose maximum 2 choices. Of course, you can see all of them are quite important, and then various subtopics are covered by the panelists today. So if you could choose maximum 2 according to your reflections, your priorities, and your understanding from today's discussion. So yes, it goes up. Okay, so I'd like to stop the voting here now. Okay, then let me share the result immediately. Okay, yes, so as you see, the number one item is address systemic, compound, and cascading risks. Of course, from the beginning of this forum, we are covering this systemic risk across the forum. So it's definitely the takeaways from many participants. If I could remind you what we had in the first poll, we asked, what are the biggest challenges for Build Back Better from COVID-19 and compound disasters? And the number one reply was implementing recovery during the ongoing response. That was the biggest challenge audience has identified at the beginning. And then now, how should we plan for recovery to reduce the impact of future pandemics and then compound disasters? Addressing systemic, compounding, and cascading risks is the highest answer from the audience. So thank you very much. I'm just, stop sharing the result. Okay, so now I'd like to open our final session of the program. It is my great honor to welcome Ms. Mami Mizutori, Special Representative of the United Nations Secretary General for Disaster Risk Reduction and Head of the United Nations Office for Disaster Risk Reduction, UNDRR. Ms. Mizutori will share brief reflections of the forum. Ms. Mizutori, please, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Yuki. So at the outset, I'd like to thank the co-organizers of the IRP Forum, the Cabinet Office of Japan, the Prefecture of Hyogo. I'd like to also thank the keynote speakers, the panelists, and the moderators, and also everybody who has been participating to this very important forum. This IRP forum has a very long history, and every year it has tackled very important issues. But I can say really that it has never been as important as this year when the whole world is struggling with COVID plus. It has been indeed a very rich forum, lots of experiences and lessons learned, and we have a lot of takeaways. This is a global crisis, and as in all crises, it is affecting everybody. But we have learned from many of you today that, again, the most vulnerable people are affected most. And there have been many concrete examples around this from the global south as well as the global north, from central governments and subnational governments. This is not your normal crisis. The analogy that this is like drought, a slow onset disaster with impact rolling in, was very frightening and real. This is a compounded disaster. Many countries have been experiencing COVID, and while struggling with COVID, with so many other natural disasters, hazards. The systemic nature of risk of the contemporary time that we live in, this COVID-19 is a textbook example. And the fluid nature of crisis is something that we have to keep in mind, because yes, it is not a linear trajectory of improvement that we will see, because we are still in the crisis and response is continuing in many, many countries. But at the same time, we need to recover. We need to build back better. in a way that we can become more resilient, greener, and more equitable. And as many of you have always also said, recovery has to be accelerated in order to minimize the loss. And importantly, this may not be, unfortunately, the last world pandemic that we are going to experience, and climate change is not going anywhere. So in short, we have to change this challenge into an opportunity, and we need to reach at the end of the tunnel a resilient, green, equitable society. And we are going to be in this together. Now, one last message is that the Secretary General has emphasized time and again that there is a lack of solidarity when we are dealing with this crisis. The cities, yes, as we have heard from our panelists, are united, but it cannot be the same. We cannot say the same thing for the countries. Right now, the distribution of the vaccine is crucial for us to reach the real phase of recovery. But here, again, we need to see much more solidarity. So let us really get through this challenge together. And the notion of helping each other, which comes out from Japan, it is a wonderful notion, not only public support, not only supporting yourself, but supporting each other. This has to be adopted. This has to be implemented in the international society as well. We need to help each other. So I would like to close by saying that the importance of IRP, where we can all come together and share our experience and our knowledge, is becoming increasingly important. And I look forward to seeing more of helping each other. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ms. Mizutori, for your insights and really thoughtfully bringing the ideas shared in this forum together with your perspective to help us round out the substantive part of this forum. As now, it is my pleasure to introduce our final speaker, Mr. Murakawa Soshi, Director, Cabinet Office of Japan, to deliver closing remarks on behalf of the co-chair of the IRP Steering Committee. Mr. Murakawa, you have the floor.
Thank you, Matsuoka-san. I'm Soshi Murakawa, Director for Disaster Management at Cabinet Office Japan. It's a great honor for me to deliver the closing remarks as co-chair of IRP Steering Committee. I would like to express my sincere appreciation to all participants, distinguished speakers, moderators, panelists. I am pleased to announce that the number of registration for this forum is more than 600. I am very happy and excited to share this event with all over the world. Due to COVID-19, it's the first time to hold this forum in virtual. I worried about how the forum would be and if it would go well, but there are so many participants and all items were well done. So I am sure that the forum must have made great success. Thanks to virtual meeting, we successfully share a lot of things with so many people, which is very significant for IRP as the international platform of knowledge management. I would like to say again many thanks to your cooperation, and I extend my sincere thanks to UNDRR, Japan office working as IRP Secretariat. While we are now forced to fight against COVID-19, we have set an opportunity to discuss its recovery in timely manner. In addition to this pandemic, due to the effects of climate change, various natural disasters have occurred all over the world, and the damage has been intensifying year by year. Moreover, we cannot forget the risk of earthquake like a big quake occurred in Indonesia last week. We are now facing complex risks of natural hazard and COVID-19. So this forum focused on compound disasters. Since the situations in both natural hazard and the pandemic are constantly changing, we have to keep knowledge sharing to fight against them. For the recovery from COVID-19 damages, I am sure that the concept of Build Back Better would be a strong booster. Build Back Better is related with the idea of creative recovery, which has supported the recovery from the Great Hanshin-Awaji earthquake in Japan and reached out to the world as Build Back Better. It's a model for reconstruction. I believe that it is a universal goal to build a resilient nation through making strong partnership and collaboration among various stakeholders based on the mind of Build Back Better. IRP is a network of knowledge. I am convinced that sharing knowledge and experiences reduce the damage of disasters and promote recovery in the world. COVID-19 is forcing us to avoid our communication, but digital transformation has been developing, which facilitates our communication and knowledge sharing. So it is now that we should enhance sharing knowledge and experience of Build Back Better all over the world. I expect your continuous cooperation and support for IRP activities. Finally, I would like to conclude my remarks by highlighting that the outcome of this forum will contribute to initiatives of recovery and reconstruction in the world. I extend my wishes for your health and good luck. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Murakawa, for your closing remarks for this year's forum. It is now time for me to bring this year's forum to a close. I'd like to thank all of our distinguished speakers and moderators, and to thank all participants around the world. You will shortly receive a survey to your registered email address, and we would be very grateful if you could provide your feedback about this forum. We have also received a lot of questions in the Q&A section. However, of course, it was quite difficult to respond to all the questions. However, as I have explained at the beginning, the organizer, IRP Secretariat, will record all the comments and the questions and then take note of them for our future reference and then also for our future discussions. So now I'd like to bring this forum to the end. On behalf of the International Recovery Platform, I'd like to extend my sincere appreciation to all of the participants around the world. Goodbye for now from Kobe, Japan. Thank you very much.